Chapter 1. The Unmarked Bride. Cade said it in front of the whole pack. That was the part one never forgave. Not the words themselves. I had heard worse from him in 7 years of marriage. It was that he waited until the great hall was full, until every wolf in Thornwood stood shoulder to shoulder around the fire pit, until Bianca Voss was close enough to touch his arm, before he said it. I will never mark Wren. She was never meant to be my Luna, and everyone here has known it since the day I brought her home. 200 wolves went quiet. I stood by the kitchen door in my apron, because that was where the alpha's unmarked wife stood during pack gatherings, not at his side, not at the table, but near the door, ready to carry out plates the moment the ceremony ended. I had chosen that spot myself the first year, before anyone told me to. It had seemed safer then, a position from which I could retreat easily if the pack's scrutiny ever turned unkind, a habit left over from years of being shuffled between households that never quite wanted me. By the 3rd year it had simply become expected, an unspoken assignment no one needed to repeat, and by the 7th, I had almost forgotten I'd ever chosen it freely at all. Some prisons build themselves quietly, one small accommodation at a time, until the walls feel less like walls and more like the shape of your own life. 7 years. 7 years of cold dinners eaten standing up, of sleeping in the room down the hall from his, of introducing myself to visiting packs as Cade's wife, because I had never once been given the right to say Luna. I had told myself it was patience. I had told myself the mark would come once he trusted me, once the pack accepted me, once. There was no once coming. I understood that now, watching Bianca's hand rest on his forearm like she had every right to it. She stays on as housekeeper, Cade said, not looking at me. That arrangement doesn't change. But the pack deserves a real Luna. Bianca will take that role, starting tonight. Someone laughed. I didn't turn to see who. The fire pit crackled behind Cade, throwing orange light across faces I had cooked for, cleaned up after, nursed through fevers during hard winters, faces that now watched me the way you watch a stranger caught in an embarrassing situation on the street, curious, unbothered, already moving on. Rain had started against the great hall's high windows sometime during his speech, a low drumming I registered only now that the room had gone quiet enough to hear it. 7 years and I could still name every wolf in that hall by scent alone, could still tell you which children had grown taller since spring, which elders had gotten frilier, which couples were expecting. None of that counted for anything standing at a kitchen door in an apron while my husband handed my title to another woman like a chore he was relieved to finally delegate. I set down the tray I was carrying, carefully, because 7 years of training does not leave a body even when the heart inside it is breaking, and I walked to where my husband stood at the center of his pack, in front of his fire, with his hand not once reaching for mine. Say it to my face, Cade, I said. Not to theirs. He looked at me then. Whatever he saw made something flicker behind his eyes, gone before I could name it. I just did. For one absurd moment, I found myself remembering our wedding day again, unbidden, the way he'd fumbled his vows, the way his hand had trembled slightly clasping mine at the altar, the way I'd told myself, foolishly, that trembling meant he cared even if the marriage itself was arranged. I had spent years building a version of him in my head who was simply too afraid to show affection openly, rather than a man who had never intended to offer any at all. Standing here now, watching him refuse even to meet my eyes properly, I understood I had spent 7 years grieving a person who had never really existed outside my own hopeful imagination. You said it to your pack. Say it to your wife. You were never my wife in the way that matters. His voice dropped, quieter, almost gentle, which was worse than if he'd shouted. You know that, Wren. You've always known that. I thought about 7 years of knowing my place at doorways. 7 years of learning which glances not to return, which conversations not to enter, which nights not to knock on his door even when the house was so cold I could see my own breath. I thought about the mark that never came, the claiming bite that was supposed to bind a Luna to her alpha and never had, not once, not even in the dark when it would have cost him nothing. Then I am done, I said, being whatever this was. The words surprised me even as I said them. I had rehearsed 100 versions of this moment in my head over the years, late at night in my narrow bed, imagining what I might finally say if Cade ever forced the issue into the open instead of letting it fester in comfortable, cowardly silence. None of those imagined speeches had ever been this short. None of them had needed to be. 7 years of careful, patient argument had all led, in the end, to 5 simple words that cost nothing to say and everything to finally mean. Bianca's laugh rang out behind him, bright and easy, the laugh of a woman who had never once stood by a door with a tray in her hands. "Where exactly do you think you're going to go, Wren? You have no pack of your own. No family that will take you back. No claim to anything here." She said it lightly, almost kindly, the way you'd point out an obvious fact to someone too foolish to have noticed it themselves, and that lightness was somehow worse than open cruelty would have been. I had watched her rehearse smaller versions of this exact tone for months, testing which words landed hardest, learning my weak points the way a hunter learns the terrain before a chase. Tonight, apparently, she'd finally decided the terrain was hers to walk freely. She was right, and that was the cruelest part. I had no pack. My parents had died when I was 11, in a border skirmish that half of Thornwood still didn't believe was an accident. And I had grown up in the care of a pack that tolerated me until Cade's father arranged this marriage as a debt repayment nobody explained to me until the wedding morning. I had spent my whole life being handed from one household to another like a piece of furniture no one wanted to keep, but no one wanted to throw away either. I remembered the wedding morning more clearly than I remembered most of the 7 years that followed it. A borrowed dress 2 sizes too big, cinched tight at the waist with a ribbon that left a mark for days. An old aunt of Cade's father braiding my hair with hands that shook slightly, murmuring that I should be grateful, that girls with no family and no prospects rarely landed anywhere half so comfortable as Thornwood's manor house. I had believed her that morning, 18 years old and desperate for anywhere to belong. It had taken 7 years standing at doorways for me to understand that comfortable and wanted were not the same word, no matter how many people tried to convince me otherwise. "I don't know where I'm going," I said, and it was the first true thing I had said in that hall all night. "But it is somewhere you are not." Bianca's smile flickered, just slightly, as though she'd expected me to fold and hadn't planned past that expectation. Behind her, 2 of Cade's father's old advisors murmured to each other, already recalculating whatever quiet plans they'd built around an obedient, unmarked housekeeper who apparently intended to stop being obedient tonight of all nights. I didn't wait to hear what they decided. 7 years of watching rooms had taught me exactly how long it takes a crowd's opinion to shift when someone finally gives them a reason, and I had no interest in staying to watch it happen in real time, under that fire, in front of every wolf who had spent 7 years perfecting the art of looking through me instead of at me. I walked out through the front doors of the Great Hall, past 200 wolves who did not move to stop me, past the fire that had never once been lit for me, into rain that had been falling on Thornwood territory for 3 days straight. The mud came up over my shoes within the first dozen steps. My apron, still tied at my waist because I hadn't thought to remove it, soaked through and clung heavy against my legs. Somewhere behind me the Great Hall's doors swung shut, muffling the noise inside back down to a low murmur, and for a moment the only sound left in the world was rain against bare earth and my own ragged breathing. Behind me, I heard Cade say something to Bianca. I didn't catch the words. I told myself I didn't want to. What I did hear, faint under the rain and the retreating sound of the hall's laughter, was a voice that did not belong to anyone in that room. It came from everywhere and nowhere, soft as moonlight even though the sky was black with storm clouds and no moon could possibly be visible. 7 years, little one. I have been waiting 7 years for you to walk out that door. I stopped in the mud, soaked through, staring up at clouds with no moon behind them, and felt for the first time in my adult life that I was not entirely alone. Chapter 2. 7 years of silence. I didn't tell anyone about the voice. Who would I have told? Cade wasn't speaking to me except to give instructions about the kitchen rotation. Bianca had moved her things into the Luna's suite by the following morning, 3 doors down from where I still slept in the servants' wing I'd been assigned the week after my wedding. 7 years of silence had taught me exactly how to survive inside a house that didn't want me. I woke before the rest of the pack. I had the ovens going by 5, breakfast laid by 6, and I made myself small in every room I entered, because a small woman is easy to overlook and an overlooked woman doesn't get blamed for things going wrong. Bianca found new ways to remind me of my place. She liked to summon me by ringing the old servant's bell in the Luna suite, the one that hadn't been used since Cade's grandmother died, just to watch me climb 3 flights of stairs for a cup of tea she didn't actually want. Some mornings she rang it twice within an hour, once for tea and once, 10 minutes later, to complain the tea had gone cold, and I climbed those same stairs both times without comment, because comment cost more than climbing did. "You must be so relieved," she told me that first week, turning a hairbrush in her hands while I stripped the bed she now slept in. "All that pressure of being Luna gone. You get to just be exactly what you're comfortable being." Winter had settled hard over Thornwood territory by then, the kind of cold that crept in through old stone regardless of how many fires burned, and I spent most mornings with chapped hands from hauling water and would before the rest of the house even stirred. The Luna suite smelled like her now. Some floral oil she wore that clashed with the cedar the room had always carried under Cade's grandmother's things. I had scrubbed those floorboards on my knees 100 times over the years, back when the room sat empty and unclaimed, and I still let myself imagine, foolishly, that it might one day be mine. Bianca had redecorated within the first week. New curtains, a vanity moved in from her old room, a standing mirror angled so that anyone entering could admire themselves before they'd even crossed the threshold. I straightened the same sheets I'd once hoped to sleep in myself and said nothing, because nothing was the only currency I had left that no one could take from me. I didn't answer. I had learned that silence cost me nothing and words cost me plenty. "Cade told me you two never even," she smiled, delicate and cruel. "Never mind. It isn't my business what didn't happen in 7 years." It was, of course, exactly her business, which was why she said it. I had learned, over the months of her occupancy, that Bianca's cruelest observations were never the ones that were false. They were always the ones with just enough truth in them to lodge somewhere I couldn't easily dig them back out. Cade and I had, in fact, never once shared a bed in 7 years of marriage, and it had taken Bianca precisely 1 week in the Luna's suite to sniff out that particular humiliation and turn it into a weapon she could deploy at her leisure. Always delivered with just enough plausible deniability that I could never accuse her outright of cruelty. I finished the room and left before my face could betray me, counting the stairs down the way I'd counted them 1,000 times before, a habit that gave my hands something to do besides shake. In the hallway outside, I nearly walked into Cade. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since his father's funeral. Up close, for just a moment, he looked almost like the boy who had stood beside me at our wedding and mumbled his vows like they cost him something to say. That boy had been gone a long time. I reminded myself of that fact daily, so I wouldn't go looking for him in this man's face. "The border patrol found wolf prints past the North Ridge," he said, like we were mid-conversation instead of barely speaking for the first time in a week. "Not ours. Not any pack we have a treaty with. Why are you telling me this?" He hesitated. "You used to be good at reading the land. Before Bianca. Before the rejection. Before 7 years had worn away whatever partnership we might once have built together into something closer to a business arrangement neither of us had ever formally negotiated." I remembered those early walks along the northern border more clearly than I let myself admit most days, Cade young and unsure of his new title, me young and foolishly hopeful. Both of us pretending the marriage might yet become something neither of our families had actually intended it to be. Before I stopped being anyone he consulted about anything. Before the marriage cooled into whatever administrative arrangement it had become. I remembered, distantly, a version of myself who used to walk the northern border with him in the first year, pointing out where the deer trails crossed, where the creek ran fast enough to mask a wolf scent. That version of me had believed things might get better. "Ask Bianca," I said. "She's your Luna now. Consult her." Something crossed his face, not quite guilt, not quite anger. "Wren, I have bread rising," I said, and walked past him. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed in the servants' wing, I heard the voice again. Clearer this time, though still distant, like a radio tuned almost to the right station. You felt him hesitate. You felt yourself want to answer. I don't know what you are, I whispered to my ceiling. Or why you keep talking to me. You will. Soon. The mark he never gave you is never going to be the thing that told you who you are. Something older is coming to do that instead. I didn't sleep well after that. Outside my window, for just a moment before I finally drifted off, I could have sworn the clouds broke just enough to let a single sliver of moonlight fall directly onto the sill, on a night the almanac in the kitchen swore was a new moon, with no moon in the sky at all. Chapter 3. The Kitchen Wife. By the third month of Bianca's reign as Thornwood's unmarked Luna, because Cade hadn't marked her either, a detail the pack gossiped about more than they ever said to my face, I had stopped expecting anything to change. The kitchen was the one room in that house that still belonged entirely to me. Bianca never set foot in it except to complain, and Cade avoided it out of some old habit from the years we still ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, before comfortable silence curdled into the other kind. I had learned to find something like peace in the rhythm of it, bread rising before dawn, stock simmering through the afternoon, the particular satisfaction of feeding 200 people well even when not one of them thought to thank me for it. It was small. It was mine. Some mornings it was the only thing that got me out of bed at all. I ran the kitchen like I ran everything else in that house, efficiently, invisibly, and alone. The younger pack members had started calling me the kitchen wife when they thought I couldn't hear, which I always could. Wolves forget that a woman who has spent 7 years listening at doorways has learned to hear everything. Bianca's cruelty had a rhythm to it, and I had learned the rhythm the way you learn a dangerous stretch of river, not to fight it, just to know exactly where the current would try to pull you under. Mornings were usually safe. Afternoons, once she'd had time to compare herself against whatever version of Luna she imagined she should already be, were not. There had been a particular afternoon, sometime in that third month, when she'd summoned the entire household staff to the great hall under the pretense of a formal inspection, only to spend an hour walking the length of the room finding fault with details no one but she could see, a chandelier not polished to her satisfaction, a rug laid a few inches off-center, silverware arranged in a pattern that apparently offended some standard she'd invented on the spot. I had stood at the end of the line with the other staff, waiting my turn, watching younger girls flinch under her scrutiny the way I remembered flinching myself in my early years there. When she finally reached me, she looked me over for a long moment and said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than any specific criticism could have. I understood, standing there, that the silence itself was the point, a reminder that I existed in that hall only at her forbearance, worth neither praise nor blame, simply tolerated. Elder Rasmus is coming for the treaty renewal, she informed me over breakfast, not looking up from her plate. You'll want the good china out. And Wren, wear something that doesn't announce your staff. Just this once. It reflects badly on the pack. I am staff, I said. You're an embarrassment, Cade is too soft to correct properly, she said, still pleasant, still smiling. I'd fix that if I were him. But I'm not, so. Good china. I set the good china out without a word, the way I always did, the way I had trained myself to do years before Bianca ever arrived to sharpen the particular cruelty of Thornwood's hierarchy into something almost artful. There had been a time, early in my marriage, when I still argued back, still tried to defend myself to Cade's father's advisors and the pack elders who treated me like an unwelcome houseguest rather than an alpha's wife. That version of me had learned, slowly and painfully, that arguing only ever cost more than it won, and silence, however bitter, was at least a currency that couldn't be devalued further. I set the good china out. I wore the gray dress that made me disappear into the wallpaper. I served Elder Rasmus his tea and refilled his glass, and stood by the door while he and Cade discussed border rights and hunting territories, tracing the pattern on the good china with my eyes just to have somewhere to look that wasn't Bianca's satisfied expression at the head of the table, and I told myself, the way I always told myself, that this was survivable because everything up to now had been survivable. What I didn't expect was for Elder Rasmus to look directly at me on his way out. He was an old wolf, silver-muzzled even in human form, one of the few pack elders who had known my parents before the skirmish that killed them. He paused in the doorway, studied me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms rise, and said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "You smell different than you did last year, girl." I'm sorry. Not wolf. Not quite human either. Something underneath both. He frowned, like he was trying to place a scent from a memory decades old. Your mother used to smell like that right before she... I leaned forward slightly, desperate for the rest of that sentence, my whole body suddenly urgent with a question I hadn't known to ask an hour earlier. Elder Rasmus's eyes held mine, old and sorrowful and full of something that looked almost like relief at finally being asked, as though he'd been carrying the unfinished thought for years and hoping someone would eventually demand he set it down. Elder Rasmus. Cade's voice, sharp behind him. The car is waiting. The old wolf held my gaze a second longer, then dipped his head and left without finishing the sentence. I stood in the doorway with the tea tray still balanced against my hip, replaying the exchange, trying to remember anything at all about my mother's scent from childhood and coming up empty. I had been 11 when she died. 11-year-olds do not catalog their mothers by scent the way wolves are meant to. I had spent those years still mostly human in my instincts, still learning which parts of myself belonged to which world. It had never once occurred to me, in 14 years since, that the gap in my memory might be hiding something larger than ordinary childhood forgetting. I stood in the doorway long after the car pulled away, my pulse loud in my ears. Your mother used to smell like that, right before she what? My parents had died when I was 11. I had no memories of my mother beyond soft fragments, a lullaby I couldn't fully recall, hands that smelled like rain and something sweeter underneath it, a necklace with a moon-shaped pendant that had been lost in the fire that took our house the same week as the border skirmish, or so I'd always been told. That night I found the necklace description in an old trunk of my parents' things Cade had let me keep, tucked in the back of my closet. The trunk itself was unremarkable. Scarred oak with a broken latch I'd never bothered fixing, holding a handful of items too small and too personal for Cade's father to have thought worth confiscating when he arranged my marriage, a child's hairbrush, a stack of letters and handwriting I didn't recognize, a single dried flower pressed flat between two pieces of wax paper. I had gone through that trunk perhaps a dozen times over 7 years and never once looked past the surface of what it held. I had never let myself, I realized now, because looking too closely at what I'd lost had always felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I had never looked closely at the single surviving photograph, my mother, laughing, wearing that same crescent pendant, her eyes a shade of silver gray that I had always assumed was a trick of old film. They were the exact color of mine. Your mother used to smell like that right before she... The voice came again as I sat on the floor of my small room with the photograph in my hands, softer now, almost tender. Before she remembered who she was. Before she chose to hide you where I could not easily find you, to keep you safe from the ones who feared what you would become. She loved you enough to make herself forgettable, little one. It cost her everything. Who are you? I whispered, and this time I meant it as a real question, not a frightened one. The voice didn't answer. But outside my window, on a night with no visible moon, I felt warmth on my face like sunlight, and I understood, with a certainty that had no logic behind it, that whoever was speaking to me had loved my mother, and now they were watching me. Chapter 4. Bianca's Shadow. I should have told someone about the voice. I should have told someone about Elder Rasmus's unfinished sentence. Instead, I did what 7 years of training had built into my bones. I said nothing, and I kept working, and I watched. Watching cost nothing and revealed everything if you were patient enough, and patience was the one skill this house had never once failed to teach me. Watching was how I noticed that Bianca disappeared for 2 hours every Thursday afternoon, always alone, always returning with the particular flesh of someone who has been somewhere they don't want discussed. Watching was how I noticed that Cade had started drinking more in the evenings, alone in his study, staring at nothing. I brought him coffee some nights instead of clearing his glass away, an old habit from before Bianca that I couldn't quite break, and he'd nod without meeting my eyes, and I'd leave, and neither of us would mention it the next morning. It was a strange, hollow kindness we still extended each other in the cracks of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything in the open. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that winter that didn't hold up well to daylight. Watching was how I noticed the new guard posted at the edge of the property, facing not outward toward potential threats, but inward toward the house. Specifically, I realized after 3 days of tracking his position from the kitchen window toward the wing where I slept. I brought him coffee on the third morning, the same way I once had for Cade, curious to see what excuse he'd give for standing watch over an unmarked housekeeper's window instead of the tree line. He took the cup with a murmured thanks and said nothing else, eyes sliding away from mine like he'd been warned not to answer questions, which told me almost as much as an answer would have. Whatever this was, it had come from higher up than a guard's own judgment, and that thought unsettled me more than the guard's presence itself. The guard rotated shifts every 6 hours, always a different face, always positioned so his line of sight ran straight up to my window rather than out toward the tree line, where an actual threat might approach from. It took me 3 days to work up the nerve to ask about it directly, 3 days of watching him watch me instead of the boarder. Why is there a guard watching my window? I finally asked Cade, catching him in the hallway outside his study on a night he'd had less whiskey than usual. He didn't meet my eyes. Precaution. Against what? Elder Rasmus filed a report after the treaty visit. Cade rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I remembered from years ago, from before, when he used to do it while working up the courage to say something difficult. About you. About what he smelled. My stomach dropped. And I don't know what it means, Wren, but I know what it could mean, and I need you where I can account for you until we understand it. His jaw tightened. There are things in the old bloodlines that packs have gone to war over. If Rasmus is right. Right about what? My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. You won't even say it. I don't know what to call it, he said, and for a moment he sounded almost young, almost like the boy at the altar 7 years ago. But whatever you are, whatever's in your blood, Bianca thinks it's dangerous. She wants you moved to the old caretaker's cottage at the property line. Away from the pack. You're going to banish me to a shed because your girlfriend is frightened of a story an old man didn't even finish telling. He winced at the word girlfriend, though not enough to correct it, and that omission told me more clearly than any argument could have exactly where his loyalties currently sat. It's not a shed, Cade said, which was somehow worse than if he'd simply denied the accusation outright. It has a working fireplace. Bianca thought. I don't care what Bianca thought, I snapped, the anger finally breaking loose after 7 years of careful containment. I care that my own husband is standing here justifying moving his wife to a cottage at the edge of his land because another woman told him to. Do you hear yourself, Cade? Do you understand what that sounds like from where I'm standing? I'm not banishing you. But he didn't correct the word girlfriend, and he didn't meet my eyes when he said it, and both of those silences told me more than a sentence did. I went back to my room that night furious in a way I hadn't let myself be in years. Fury was dangerous for a woman with no pack, no protection, and no claim to anything, so I had trained it out of myself the way you train a wolf pup off furniture. But it came roaring back now, hot and bright, and underneath it, something else stirred, a pressure behind my sternum, warm and heavy, like a held breath finally released. The window rattled in its frame though there was no wind. I looked down at my hands and saw, for just a fraction of a second before it vanished, a faint silver shimmer along my knuckles, like moonlight caught under my skin. There you are, the voice said, warmer than I had ever heard it. I felt that. 7 years buried, and it only took real anger to crack the seal. You're stronger than they know, Wren. Stronger than you know. What is happening to me? The beginning, the voice said. Bianca is right to be afraid. She simply doesn't understand yet what she should be afraid of. Downstairs, I heard Bianca's voice rise in the front hall, arguing with someone at the door, and beneath the argument, a low growl that didn't belong to any wolf I recognized from Thornwood territory, a growl with an accent to it, foreign, powerful, and close enough that whoever it belonged to was standing on our porch. Chapter 5. A debt called in. I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down into the front hall, where Bianca stood with her arms crossed, blocking the doorway from a man I had never seen in Thornwood before. The house had gone strange around me since the window rattled, quieter somehow, every sound sharper, as if my own ears had shifted their tuning to catch things they'd missed for 25 years. My pulse still hadn't settled from the pressure in my chest moments earlier, that strange coiled heat that had rattled the window glass, and some instinct told me the two things were connected before I had any reason to believe it. He was tall in the particular way that meant something even before he shifted, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, dressed too well for a border visit, with an easy, dangerous calm that made every hair on my arm stand up. There was a stillness to him that didn't match the wet, blustering night around us, as if the storm had agreed, out of some old respect, not to touch him. Two wolves in human form flanked him, both wearing colors I didn't recognize, deep green and gold, nothing like Thornwood's gray and black. "This is Thornwood territory," Bianca was saying, her voice pitched for an authority she hadn't earned and clearly knew it, her chin lifted a fraction too high to be anything but performance. "You don't get to just walk onto our land." "I sent word 3 days ago," the stranger said, unbothered. Alpha Cade agreed to a border council. "I'm here to collect on that agreement, not to start a war, unless someone here is determined to give me one." Bianca's composure cracked just slightly at the mention of a war, though she recovered quickly, drawing herself up taller as if height alone might compensate for the authority she plainly didn't have. I watched the exchange with a strange, detached fascination, cataloging every detail the way I'd trained myself to catalog every conversation in that house for 7 years, who deferred to whom, whose confidence was real and whose was performance, which threats carried weight and which were simply noise. Cade came down the stairs 2 at a time, tucking in his shirt, clearly not expecting the visit despite what the stranger claimed. "Ronan, you're early." So this was Ronan. I filed the name away, watching from the shadows at the top of the stairs, close enough to hear everything, far enough to stay unseen. Old habits, useful now for reasons I couldn't yet name. I had heard the name Ashgrave spoken in careful, respectful tones my whole life at Thornwood, always at a distance, always in the context of treaties and border negotiations that had nothing to do with me. Cade's father used to say the Ashgrave line held territory older than any pack's written history, though he'd never explained what that meant beyond a vague, uneasy respect he reserved for very few rivals. Watching Ronan now, unhurried and entirely unbothered by Bianca's posturing, I understood for the first time exactly what that old respect had actually been describing. "I'm exactly on time," Ronan said. "You've had 6 months to answer my last 3 letters about the disputed hunting ground past the North Ridge." I got tired of waiting for a response that wasn't coming. "We've had internal matters," Cade said, and something in his voice made it clear he didn't want to elaborate. Ronan's gaze drifted, unhurried, across the front hall, the 2 fine china displayed on the shelf, Bianca's expensive dress, the general air of a household performing wealth it hadn't quite earned, and then, for reasons I couldn't explain, up the staircase, directly to the shadow where I stood. I froze. There was no way he should have seen me. The stairwell was dark, I was 3 flights up, and I hadn't made a sound. But his eyes found mine anyway, and held them, and something passed between us that I felt in my chest like a struck bell, recognition, though we had never met, though I had no earthly reason to know this man's face. His nostrils flared, subtle, controlled. Whatever he scented in that moment changed his posture entirely, a fraction of an inch, enough that Cade noticed and turned to see what had caught his rival's attention. I stepped back into the dark before Cade's gaze reached the stairs. "Who else is in this house?" Ronan asked, too casual, his eyes flicking back to Cade. "My housekeeper," Cade said, and I felt the word land like a slap even from 3 floors up, even though I had heard worse. "Your housekeeper," Ronan repeated, and something in his tone made it clear he didn't believe the description, though he let it pass without further comment. "About that borderland, Cade. I want it resolved before the next full moon, or I start treating the dispute as an act of aggression, and my pack does not respond kindly to aggression. Bring whatever paperwork you have. I'll expect you at Ashgrave within the week." He left without waiting for a response, his 2 wolves falling in step behind him, and the front door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the whole house. Bianca rounded on Cade the moment the car pulled away. "Ashgrave. You're going to Ashgrave?" That man is dangerous, Cade. Everyone knows what happened to the last pack that crossed him. I know exactly what happened to the last pack that crossed him, Cade said grimly. That's why I'm going. I stayed at the top of the stairs long after they'd both retreated to the study, my heart still pounding from the moment Ronan's eyes had found mine in the dark. I didn't understand what had passed between us. I only knew that for the first time in 7 years, someone had looked at me and seen something worth looking twice for. His name is Ronan Ashgrave, the voice said quietly, Alpha King of the Old Kingdom, and the only wolf south of the ridge whose bloodline runs anywhere near as old as yours. He felt you before he saw you. That has never happened to him before either. Why does that matter? Because you're about to need allies, little one, and the ones you were promised by marriage have already shown you exactly what they're worth. Chapter 6. The Missing Mark. The week before Cade left for Ashgrave, the pack doctor came to the house, not for me, though I wished it were, but for Bianca, who had been complaining of headaches and dizziness she blamed, loudly and often, on stress from managing a household that should have been handled properly years ago. I brought in ice water and a cool cloth without being asked, an old reflex from years of being the one who nursed every fever and every sprained ankle in that house long before Bianca arrived to inherit a title without any of the labor that used to come attached to it. She took the cloth without thanking me, pressed it to her temple, and told the doctor, in the particular tone she reserved for describing her own suffering, that the headaches had started roughly a month earlier and gotten steadily worse. I overheard the doctor's diagnosis through the study door while bringing in the tea tray, my hands steadier around the porcelain than they had any right to be given what I already suspected the answer was. There's no medical cause I can find, Alpha. Might I ask, has anything unusual happened in the house recently? Any disturbances in the pack bond? Anything affecting the wards? No, Cade said, too fast. The doctor didn't look convinced, but he was a pack physician, not a fool, and he knew better than to press an alpha on a subject the alpha had already closed. He prescribed rest and quiet for Bianca's headaches, packed his bag, and left with a final glance toward the hallway where I stood, as if some instinct told him the true source of the household's disturbance was standing closer than anyone in that study realized. I nearly dropped the tray. I knew exactly what had caused Bianca's headaches because I had felt the same pressure behind my own eyes every time the silver shimmer rose under my skin, every time the voice grew louder in the dead of night. Something in me was waking up, and the house's old wards, laid down generations ago to protect a pack, not to accommodate whatever I was becoming, were straining under the change. I set the tray down and left before either of them noticed my hands were shaking. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 7 years. I went looking for the wedding contract itself, buried in the study's records, the document Cade's father had drawn up the week before our marriage. I had signed it as an 18-year-old girl with no family and no choices, and I had never once, in 7 years, actually read the fine print. I found it after midnight, when the house was finally quiet, in a locked drawer I picked open with a hairpin I'd learned to use for exactly this kind of trespass years ago and never had reason to. The study smelled of old paper and Cade's cologne, and somewhere down the hall a floorboard settled the way old houses do at night, enough to freeze me mid-motion twice before I finally worked the lock free. The marriage was real. The alpha bond, however, required a formal mark, a claiming bite given freely, witnessed by the pack, to be legally binding under the old laws. Without it, I was his wife on paper, but not his Luna under wolf law. Not truly pack. Which meant, I realized with a cold, sinking understanding that I had spent 7 years with no actual legal protection at all. Bianca could be marked tomorrow and become the real Luna in every sense that mattered, and there would be nothing I could do to stop it. Worse, tucked behind the marriage contract, I found a second document. Older. My parents' names on it, alongside Cade's father's signature, dated the year before my parents died. In consideration of a debt owed to the Thornwood pack regarding the border incident of that year, the undersigned agree that upon reaching maturity, the child Wren shall be given in marriage to the Thornwood heir to satisfy the debt in full. A debt. My marriage had never been a marriage. It had been payment for something my parents had done, or something that had been done to them, and no one, not Cade, not his father, not anyone in 7 years, had ever told me what the debt actually was. I sat back on my heels in the dark study, the old floorboards cold through my nightgown, and let myself finally feel the full weight of it. 18 years old, grieving alone, and someone had looked at that grief and seen an opportunity to settle old accounts rather than a child who needed protecting. I thought of the wedding morning again, the borrowed dress, the aunt's murmured instructions to be grateful, and understood now exactly what that gratitude had actually been purchasing. I read the document 3 more times, hunting for a clause, a footnote, anything that might explain the nature of the debt itself, and found nothing beyond the bare fact of its existence. Whatever my parents had owed Thornwood, or whatever Thornwood believed it was owed on their behalf, the specifics had apparently mattered less to Cade's father than simply having a legal mechanism to bind me to his son before either of us had any say in the matter. I sat with that realization for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, understanding that I had spent 7 years grieving a marriage that had never actually been about me at all. The border incident, the voice murmured, and for the first time I heard something that sounded almost like anger in it. The one that killed your parents. They did not die in a skirmish, little one. They were hunted. And the pack that failed to protect them used your grief to buy your future instead of returning it to you. Who hunted them? The voice went quiet for a long moment. When it finally answered, the words fell like stones into still water. Ask Elder Rasmus what he really smelled on you. Ask him what your mother smelled like the night she died. He is the only wolf left in Thornwood old enough to remember the truth, and old enough, I think, to finally be tired of keeping it. I sat on the floor of the study until dawn, the marriage contract in my lap, understanding for the first time in my adult life that everything I had believed about my own life, my marriage, my parents' deaths, my place in this house, had been built on a foundation someone else had chosen to hide from me. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Pack. Elder Rasmus lived alone at the edge of Thornwood territory, in a cabin his family had kept for 3 generations, close enough to the pack to attend council meetings, far enough to avoid most of its politics. I had passed his cabin 100 times over the years without ever once stopping, some unspoken agreement between us that whatever he knew about my mother was better left undisturbed. That agreement had ended the moment he called her by name in front of Cade and a car full of border guards. I walked there the next afternoon, telling Bianca I needed to gather herbs from the eastern meadow, a lie easy enough that she didn't bother questioning it. He opened the door before I knocked, like he'd been expecting me. My excuse about the eastern meadow herbs sat forgotten in my throat the moment I saw his face, though I doubted, looking at him now, that he'd have questioned any excuse I offered him that morning. I wondered how long it would take, he said, stepping back to let me in. His cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried sage, and something underneath it that I now recognized, with a jolt, as the same not quite human, not quite wolf scent he'd noted on me during the treaty visit. You knew my mother, I said. It wasn't a question. I loved your mother in the way an old wolf loves someone he watched grow up and then watched leave for a life he couldn't follow her into. He gestured for me to sit by the fire. Celine was never entirely of this world, Wren. Neither, I suspect, are you. He poured 2 cups of something dark and bitter from a kettle already warming over the flames, and I took mine gratefully, glad for something to hold on to while the ground of my entire understanding of myself shifted beneath me. She arrived at Thornwood the summer I turned 30, he continued, staring into the fire rather than at me, as if the memory were easier to hold at that particular angle. No pack of her own. No explanation for where she'd come from, only a quiet, unshakable calm that made half the pack fall in love with her within a season and the other half deeply suspicious. Your father was among the first sort. I confess I was somewhere in between. I found the debt contract. My marriage to Cade was payment for something. Something that happened the year my parents died. I made myself say the next part steadily, though my voice wanted to shake. You said I smelled like her right before she died. Before she what, Elder Rasmus? Finish the sentence you never finished. The old wolf was quiet for a long time, staring into his fire. Before she remembered what she was, he finally said, Your mother was not born a wolf, and not entirely human either. She came to Thornwood territory already grown, already hiding from something, and she never told anyone the whole truth of where she came from. Not even your father, I don't think, though he loved her enough not to ask twice when she said no. Where did she come from? The old stories call it the Temple of the Silver Moon. Most wolves treat it as a myth, a place where the moon goddess herself is said to walk among her children, the rare few born of her blood scattered through mortal bloodlines over centuries, hidden, protected, until they're needed. He looked at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I did not believe the stories were literal until the treaty visit, when I smelled on you exactly what I smelled on your mother the week before the border incident. Divine blood, Wren. Old blood. The kind that certain wolves have hunted for power for longer than Thornwood Pack has existed. Is that what killed her? Wolves hunting her for what she was. I believe so. I have believed so for 11 years and said nothing, because saying it aloud would have put you in exactly the danger your mother died trying to spare you. His voice caught on the word danger, an old man's guilt finally spilling past the careful containment he'd maintained for over a decade. His jaw tightened. Cade's father knew more than he ever told his son. The debt marriage was never really about a border incident, Wren. I think it was about keeping you close, keeping you accounted for, in case whatever hunted your mother ever came looking for her daughter. The fire popped. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters, though the sky through the window was clear and still. Rasmus watched the shutters rattle with an expression that told me he'd noticed the same impossible detail I had, and neither of us said anything about it, as if naming it too soon might frighten it away. Why tell me now? I asked. Because you're already changing. I felt it on you the moment you walked in here, stronger than it was even a month ago. Elder Rasmus reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, worn soft with age. Your mother gave me this the week before she died, and told me to keep it safe until her daughter came looking for the truth. I think that day is today. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was the crescent moon pendant from the photograph, the one I'd believed lost in the fire that took our house. She never lost it, I whispered. She hid it. There's a difference. He pressed it into my palm, and the moment my fingers closed around the cool metal, the silver shimmer beneath my skin flared bright enough to light the whole cabin, and somewhere far beyond Thornwood territory, I felt, impossibly, unmistakably, something ancient turn its attention toward me for the very first time. Chapter 8. The Border Patrol. I hid the pendant beneath my dress, against my skin, and walked back toward the house with my mind spinning through everything Elder Rasmus had told me. Divine blood. A hunted mother. A debt marriage that had never been about a debt at all, but about keeping me contained, accounted for, close enough to control if whatever hunted my mother ever came asking questions. I was so lost in the unraveling of 7 years of assumptions that I didn't notice the border patrol until I nearly walked into them at the tree line. 3 Thornwood wolves in half-shift, for bristling, blocking the path back to the house, close enough that I could smell the tension coming off them before I even registered what they'd cornered. At their center, unmistakably, stood one of Ronan Ashgrave's green and gold wolves, the same one who had flanked him during the treaty visit, held at claw point, blood matting the fur along his shoulder. Found him past the ridge marker, one of the Thornwood wolves growled, shifting enough to speak clearly. Says he's just patrolling his own border. Funny, since our border marker is 400 yards behind him. I recognized the marker dispute immediately, having spent the previous night poring over exactly this stretch of the border map in Cade's study. The old creekbed boundary, the one my parents' generation would have recognized, ran considerably further into what Thornwood now claimed as its own territory. Someone had moved the physical markers at some point in the last decade without bothering to update the actual treaty lines, and I had a sudden, uneasy suspicion about exactly when that quiet theft might have happened, and why. The Ashgrave wolf, even injured, held himself with a controlled stillness that told me he was more dangerous than his current position suggested. The kind of stillness I recognized from years of watching Cade's most experienced fighters hold themselves during tense negotiations, patient and coiled rather than afraid. His eyes found mine over the shoulders of his captors, and something in them sharpened. Recognition. The same unsettling recognition I'd felt from Ronan himself. "You're the one from the house," he said. "The housekeeper." "Quiet," the lead Thornwood wolf snapped. "Let him go," I said, before I fully decided to say it. Every wolf in the clearing turned to look at me. I felt heat rise in my face, but I didn't retract the words. It was strange, standing there under the weight of 5 sets of eyes, to realize that some part of me had been waiting 7 years for a moment exactly like this one, a chance to speak with authority I hadn't been granted, simply because no one else in that clearing seemed prepared to speak at all. "This isn't your business, Wren," the lead wolf said, not unkindly. I recognized him, Tomas, a boy I'd bandaged skinned knees for a decade ago, now grown into a patrol leader who still, buried under pack loyalty, remembered a kinder version of our history. "Alpha's orders are any Ashgrave wolf found past the treaty line gets held for questioning." He set himself the markers 400 yards off. "That's a border dispute, not a trespass. You know that, Tomas." I stepped closer, my heart hammering, aware that I had no authority in this pack to be giving orders, aware and doing it anyway. "If you hurt an Ashgrave wolf over a marker dispute 3 days before Cade is due at their territory for treaty talks, you're not defending Thornwood. You're starting the war Ronan already threatened." Tomas hesitated, glancing at his companions, and for a moment none of the 3 wolves moved at all, caught between an order they'd been given and a consequence none of them wanted to personally own. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, not respect for my authority, which didn't exist, but the plain, practical fear of what Ronan Ashgrave might do to a pack that mishandled one of his own on the eve of negotiations. "Alpha didn't say to release anyone," he said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. "Alpha isn't here," I said. "I am. And I'm telling you this is a bad decision that will be remembered as yours, not mine." When Ronan asks why one of his wolves came home bleeding over a border he was standing 400 yards outside of. It was a bluff built on nothing but logic and the small authority that came from simply being the only person in the clearing speaking with certainty. It worked anyway. Tomas released his hold, and the Ashgrave wolf staggered upright, favoring the bloodied shoulder. "Go," I told him. "Now, before anyone changes their mind." He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Ronan will want to know your name." "Wren," I said. "Tell him whatever you'd like about the rest." He disappeared into the tree line at a limping run, and I turned back to find Tomas and his patrol staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in 7 years. Not pity, not dismissal, but something closer to uncertain respect. "Alpha's not going to like that," Tomas said. "Alpha doesn't get to be surprised by consequences he refuses to prevent," I said, and walked past them toward the house, my hands still shaking, the pendant warm against my skin like it approved. Behind me, faint on the wind, I heard the voice again, and this time it sounded almost like laughter. "There she is," it said. 7 years hidden under an apron, and one conversation with an old wolf was all it took to remember she has a spine. Chapter 9. What the Woods Hide. Cade heard about the border patrol before I made it back to the house. I could tell from how he stood waiting on the porch, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching me approach with an expression that gave away far less than it usually did. News traveled fast in Thornwood, faster than any of us liked to admit, and I imagined Tomas had reported the whole encounter within minutes of my walking away. Good, I thought. Let him hear it from someone other than me. "You released an Ashgrave wolf caught on our side of the line," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying none of the coldness I'd braced for and something closer, unsettlingly, to curiosity instead. "I stopped your patrol from starting a war 3 days before you're due to negotiate with the man who threatened one." I kept walking past him toward the door. "You're welcome. That's not your decision to make." I stopped, turned, and let 7 years of swallowed words finally come up. "Whose decision was it then?" "Bianca's?" "She wasn't there." "Yours?" "You weren't there either." I was the only person in that clearing with enough sense to see past pack pride, so yes, Cade, it was my decision, because someone needed to make one. Something shifted in his face, not anger, though I'd braced for it, but something closer to the way he used to look at me in the first year, before Bianca, before the silence closed over everything between us like water over a stone. Tomas said you spoke like, he stopped himself. Like what? Like a Luna, he said quietly. The word landed between us, and neither of us moved to pick it up. It sat there in the space between two people who had spent 7 years carefully avoiding exactly this kind of honesty, too fragile to touch and too significant to ignore, and I found myself, absurdly, wanting to laugh at the sheer unfairness of finally hearing that word applied to me only after I'd stopped needing his permission to believe it myself. I need to go to Ashgrave in 3 days, he said finally. Ronan's terms were specific. He wants whoever handled the border incident today present at the negotiations. He's already heard about it. His wolf must have reported in fast. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 7 years invisible in my own home, and one afternoon standing up to a border patrol had somehow reached the ears of a rival Alpha King fast enough to reroute an entire treaty negotiation. I'm not going as decoration, Cade, I said. If Ronan wants the person who handled the incident, he wants someone who can speak for herself in that room, not someone standing by a door with a tray. That's not my problem. He specifically asked for you by name, Wren. Tomas told him. Cade's jaw worked. I don't know what happened out there, but you made an impression on a wolf king who does not make requests lightly. I need you at Ashgrave. I thought of the crescent pendant warm against my skin, of Elder Rasmus's unfinished stories, of the voice that had been growing clearer every single day since I walked out of that hall in the rain. I thought of Ronan's eyes finding mine in the dark stairwell, recognition passing between two strangers who had never met. Fine, I said. I'll come. But not as your housekeeper, Cade. If I'm standing in that room, I stand there as myself or I don't go at all. He studied me for a long moment, and for the first time in years, I watched him actually see me, not the woman who brought his meals and pressed his shirts and disappeared into doorways, but someone else entirely. Someone he'd apparently forgotten was still in there. It should have felt like a victory. Mostly it just felt like grief for the 7 years it had taken him to look. Fine, he said. As yourself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window with the pendant in my hand, watching clouds shift over a sky the almanac insisted held no visible moon, and felt the silver warmth under my skin pulse steadily, like a second heartbeat learning its rhythm. You are close now, the voice said, softer than I'd ever heard it, almost reverent. Closer to remembering than you have been in 7 years of forgetting. Ashgrave territory sits at the edge of the old temple grounds. If you walk far enough into those woods, little one, something will be waiting that has waited a very long time to finally meet you. Are you my mother? I whispered into the dark, the question I hadn't let myself ask until now. The silence that followed felt different than the voice's usual quiet, heavier, weighted with something I couldn't name. I loved your mother as my own daughter, the voice finally said. And I have loved you the same way since the night you were born beneath a moon that has never once stopped watching over you, even in all the years you believed yourself unwatched, unwanted, and alone. Chapter 10. The Wolf Who Knew My Name. We left for Ashgrave territory 2 days later, a small convoy of 3 cars, Cade in the lead vehicle, Bianca insisting on a seat beside him despite his obvious reluctance, and me in the back of the second car with 2 guards who didn't bother hiding their confusion about why I'd been included at all. I had packed lightly, 1 bag and the pendant tucked beneath my collar, and spent most of the drive watching Thornwood's gray hills give way to unfamiliar country, a strange calm settling over me the farther we traveled from the house that had shaped my last 7 years. Whatever waited at Ashgrave, it could not possibly be smaller than the life I was already living. That thought alone made the long drive easier to bear than it had any right to be. The land changed the closer we got to the border. Thornwoods gray, rain-heavy hills giving way to something wilder, older, forests so dense the road narrowed to a single lane beneath a canopy that blocked most of the daylight. Even the air tasted different through the cracked window, sharper, greener, carrying a mineral coldness that reminded me, oddly, of the smell right before a lightning storm. I felt the pendant grow warmer with every mile, a low thrum against my sternum that matched the pace of my own heartbeat. You feel it too, Cade said, appearing at my window when the convoy stopped to let the lead car navigate a fallen tree across the road. He'd walked back from his own vehicle, leaving Bianca inside it, and something about his tone was quieter than I'd heard from him in years. The land. It's different here. Older, I said. Ronan's territory sits on ground his family has held since before written treaties, before Thornwood existed as a pack at all. Cade glanced toward the trees, uneasy. There are stories about these woods. Some of the elders say the old gods used to walk here, before the packs pushed the wild magic back to the margins. Do you believe the stories? I didn't, he said, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't earned in 7 years and didn't fully trust now. Until Rasmus filed his report about you. Until today, watching you handle Tomas's patrol like you'd been born knowing how. Until right now, standing here, feeling something come off you that I have no name for. I studied his profile in the dim light of the car's interior, the familiar lines of a face I had once, briefly, foolishly loved, and felt a strange grief for the years we might have had if he'd looked at me this way from the start instead of only now, when circumstance rather than choice had finally forced his attention. I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to. The convoy got moving again, and 20 minutes later the trees opened onto Ashgrave's holdings, not a house like Thornwood's manor, but something closer to a fortified estate, dark stone walls climbing a hillside, banners in green and gold snapping in wind that hadn't touched the forest below. Banners in deep green and gold snapped along the fortress walls, catching the last of the afternoon light, and somewhere beyond them I could hear what sounded almost like distant chimes, though there was no wind to account for it. Ronan himself waited at the gate, flanked by a dozen wolves in formal dress, and when the car stopped, his gaze went past Cade, past Bianca, straight to the back window where I sat. He opened my door himself before any guard could reach it, an act that made every wolf in his retinue go very still, a dozen pairs of eyes flicking between their king and the unremarkable-looking woman he'd just extended a courtesy no visiting dignitary, let alone a rival alpha's housekeeper, had any right to expect. Wren, he said, and the way he said my name, like he'd been practicing it, like it meant something, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I've been looking forward to finally meeting the woman who talked my patrol wolf's captors into releasing him with nothing but logic and nerve. You heard about that. I hear about everything on my border. His eyes moved over me, not unkindly, but with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time in 7 years, entirely seen. Tomas's wolf said something else, though. Said you smelled like the old stories. Like something out of the temple ruins at the edge of my territory. Behind me, I heard Cade's sharp intake of breath. I don't know what that means, I said, which was true and also no longer entirely true, given everything Elder Rasmus had told me 2 days before. I think you do, Ronan said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, his eyes steady on mine. I think you've felt it your whole life and no one ever gave you a name for it. I can help with that, if you'll let me. Behind him, deep in the ancient forest that ringed his territory, I heard something that made every hair on my body rise, a sound like wind chimes made of moonlight, faint and impossibly beautiful, coming from somewhere in those old, old trees. The temple, the voice whispered, urgent now, alive with something like joy. It knows you're close. It has been waiting 7 years to finally sing your name. Chapter 11. Silver in my veins. Ashgrave's guest wing was nothing like Thornwood's servant quarters. I had a room with a view of the mountains, a fire already lit against the evening chill, and a formality to my treatment that felt, after 7 years, almost like a costume I hadn't earned the right to wear. A maid had unpacked my single bag without comment, hung my one good dress in a wardrobe built for 10 times that many, and asked, with what sounded like genuine curiosity rather than pity, whether I preferred tea or wine before bed. I didn't know how to answer. No one had asked me a preference in longer than I could remember. I couldn't sleep. Somewhere past midnight, drawn by the same faint chiming I'd heard at the gate, I wrapped myself in a cloak from the wardrobe and slipped out through the terrace doors into the dark. The mountain air was colder than Thornwood's, thinner somehow, and it cleared my head in a way I badly needed after a day spent being looked at like a curiosity by an entire fortress full of strangers. The chiming led me along a moonlit path into the tree line, past guards who somehow failed to notice me, as if the forest itself were folding around me to keep me hidden. The deeper I walked, the warmer the pendant grew against my skin, until it burned bright enough that I could see my own hands by its glow. I stopped at the edge of a clearing where moss-covered stones stood in a broken circle, half swallowed by roots, clearly ancient, clearly abandoned by everyone except the moonlight pooling silver and thick across the ground. The moment I stepped inside the circle, the silver light rose to meet me. It didn't hurt. It felt like sinking into warm water after a lifetime of cold. My veins lit from within, visible through my skin, tracing up my arms in patterns like frost on glass, and for one suspended second I saw myself reflected in a puddle at my feet, eyes gone fully silver, no pupil, no white. Just moonlight looking back at me. I gasped and the vision broke, my eyes returning to normal, my knees buckling under the sudden absence of whatever had been holding me upright. My whole body felt hollowed out and refilled at once, the way I imagined a held breath might feel after years of never being released, and for a moment I simply knelt there in the wet moss, shaking, trying to remember how to stand on legs that no longer felt entirely like my own. Careful. I hadn't heard him approach. Ronan crouched beside me in the moss, steadying my shoulder with a hand that felt too warm to belong to someone standing in a cold forest at midnight. "You followed me," I said. I felt the wards on the circle wake up for the first time in longer than my own lifetime. I would have followed anyone for that. That it was you doesn't surprise me as much as it should. His eyes searched my face, not with suspicion but something gentler. "What did you see?" "Myself. But not myself." I pressed a hand to my chest, where the pendant had gone warm and quiet again, its work apparently done for the night. My eyes were silver. Just for a second. He helped me settle onto a dry patch of moss near the circle's edge, his cloak draped over my shoulders before I'd even realized I was shivering, the mountain cold finally registering now that the silver light had receded back beneath my skin. "That's an old blessing," Ronan said quietly. "One my grandmother used to describe from stories, not memory. She said the last true child of the moon goddess walked this territory before even her time, and this circle was built to honor her. I always assumed it was a story built to make an old ruin feel important." He looked at me like the ground had shifted under a belief he'd held his whole life. "I don't think it was just a story. Your grandmother told you about a child of the moon and you never once thought to ask what happened to her?" I asked, still catching my breath, my knees pressed into damp moss that smelled of soil and something sweeter underneath it. I thought she meant a metaphor. A way of describing an especially gifted Luna from some earlier generation. He shook his head slowly. I did not expect to be standing in this circle 100 years later, watching the story prove itself true in front of me. Elder Rasmus thinks my mother was one of them. Whatever they were. I met his eyes. He thinks I might be too. I think he's right. Ronan's voice was low, careful, like he was handling something fragile. "I think that's what I felt in your husband's stairwell, before I even knew your name. Divine blood doesn't announce itself to just anyone, Wren. It called to something in me that I didn't know I had until you were standing 3 floors above me in the dark." The forest went very quiet around us, the chiming sound fading like it had said what it needed to say. Ronan helped me to my feet, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary at my waist, and neither of us moved to close the remaining distance between us, though both of us, I think, wanted to. "Cade doesn't look at you like that," Ronan said, quiet, almost to himself. "Cade hasn't looked at me like anything in 7 years. Then he's a fool who was handed something extraordinary and never once thought to unwrap it." Ronan stepped back, giving me space, though something in his eyes said the words had cost him effort. "Come. Before the guards notice you're missing and decide I've kidnapped my rival's wife in the middle of the night." I laughed despite myself, the first real laugh I'd managed in longer than I could remember, and something about the sound of it in that ancient, moonlit clearing felt like the first stone in a foundation I hadn't known I was allowed to build. Chapter 12. The Stranger's Eyes. The treaty negotiations began the next morning in Ashgrave's main hall, and I sat at the table as myself, exactly as I demanded of Cade, not by the door, not with a tray in my hands, but in a chair with my name attached to it. A steward set a folder in front of me alongside identical folders for Cade and Ronan, as if my presence at that table were the most ordinary thing in the world rather than the first time in 7 years anyone had treated my opinion as worth recording. Bianca hated it. I watched her jaw tighten every time Ronan directed a question my way instead of hers, every time he deferred to my read of the border maps I'd spent years quietly studying in Cade's study while pretending only to be dusting the shelves. The disputed hunting ground follows the old creek bed, not the current marker line, I said, tracing the map with a finger, the same suspicion from the clearing the day before finally finding words in front of the one audience who could actually confirm it. The markers were moved 11 years ago, after the border incident. I don't think that was an accident. Ronan's eyes sharpened. Explain. My parents died in that incident. I only recently learned it wasn't the accident I was told it was. I glanced at Cade, whose face had gone carefully blank. If someone moved the markers the same year, it's worth asking why and who benefited. This isn't the appropriate venue for personal grievances, Bianca cut in, smiling thinly. We're here to discuss hunting rights, not old family tragedies. I met her eyes across the table, unflinching, letting 7 years of swallowed retorts finally find their moment. A moved marker isn't a personal grievance, Bianca. It's a border violation with a paper trail. I'd have thought Thornwood's Luna would want that resolved as much as anyone. Old family tragedies that happen to explain a border dispute currently on the table seem entirely appropriate to discuss, Ronan said, not looking at her. Continue, Wren. Bianca's smile stayed fixed, but her knuckles went white around her pen. We spent 3 hours untangling a decade of quiet territorial theft, papers spread across the whole table, Ronan occasionally glancing my way with something like open admiration whenever I caught a detail his own stewards had missed, and by the end of it, Ronan's steward had drawn up terms that returned the disputed creek bed to Ashgrave land, exactly where it belonged, and Cade signed without argument, his earlier bluster about treaty violations entirely deflated by the evidence I'd laid out. You made him look foolish in front of his own pack, Bianca hissed at me in the hallway afterward, catching my arm hard enough to bruise. Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated Cade in front of a rival alpha. I told the truth about a border theft that predates either of us caring about it, I said, pulling my arm free. If that humiliates him, the humiliation isn't mine to carry. You think this changes anything? You think because a wolf king finds you interesting for 5 minutes, you're suddenly someone. Bianca's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the fear underneath. Her fingers had curled tight around the strap of her bag, knuckles white, betraying a panic her voice worked hard to disguise. You will always be the housekeeper, Wren. The unmarked wife nobody wanted. Whatever Ronan Ashgrave sees in you is a novelty and novelties fade. Maybe, I said. But I'd rather be a novelty who's finally being seen than a Luna who's terrified of being seen through. I left her standing in the hallway, her face gone pale with a fury I recognized because I had spent 7 years swallowing the exact same feeling myself. That evening, at the formal dinner marking the treaty's conclusion, Ronan seated me beside him, a placement that raised eyebrows across the hall, including Cade's, who watched the arrangement with an expression I couldn't quite name. You handled Bianca in the hallway, Ronan said, low, for my ears only. My guards reported it. You didn't have to defend yourself to her. 7 years of practice, I said. I've gotten good at not needing anyone's permission to survive an argument. I noticed. His eyes held mine, warm and steady in a way that made my chest ache with something I hadn't let myself feel in longer than I could remember. I meant what I said in the woods, Wren. Whatever you're becoming, I want to understand it. And I want to understand it standing beside you, not across a negotiating table from your husband. Across the hall, I caught Cade watching us, his expression unreadable, his hand tight around a wine glass he wasn't drinking from. Chapter 13. A voice not my own. I woke that night to the pendant burning hot against my skin, hot enough to wake me from a dead sleep. hot enough that I sat up gasping before I'd even opened my eyes. The fire in my grate had burned down to embers, and moonlight fell across the floor in a long silver bar that hadn't been there when I fell asleep, though the shutters were closed and the curtains drawn tight against the mountain wind. The voice was different this time, not the gentle presence I'd grown used to over the past weeks, but something sharper, more urgent, threaded through with warning. Danger, little one. Close. Someone in this house means you harm before the sun rises. I was on my feet and dressed before I'd fully processed the words, some old instinct from 7 years of reading rooms for threats overriding the part of me still half asleep. My fingers fumbling the laces of my boots in the dark rather than waste time lighting a candle. I slipped into the hallway just in time to see a shadow move past the guest wing's east window. Not a guard, not dressed in ash-grave green, moving with the low, careful gait of someone who did not want to be seen. I followed at a distance, staying to the shadows the way I'd learned to in Thornwood's hallways, and watched the figure slip into the study where the treaty documents had been locked away that afternoon. Through the cracked door, I saw them lift the newly signed treaty from Ronan's desk, along with a folder I recognized with a jolt, the same style of folder Cade kept his private correspondence in. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Evidence against Cade's father being smuggled out before the ink even dried on a treaty meant to repair the very harm that evidence documented. The figure turned toward the window to check for guards, and moonlight caught their face. Bianca. For one disorienting second, I nearly convinced myself I was mistaken, that some trick of the moonlight had reshaped an unfamiliar servant's features into hers, but there was no mistaking the particular tilt of her chin. The same practiced composure she wore even when she believed no one was watching. I should have called for help. Instead, some new confidence rising in my chest, warm and certain, I stepped into the doorway myself. Taking souvenirs? She startled so hard she nearly dropped the folder. Wren, this isn't what it looks like. It looks exactly like you stealing a signed treaty and Cade's private files from a rival alpha study in the middle of the night. I'm struggling to imagine an innocent version of that. You don't understand what's at stake, she hissed, clutching the folder to her chest. If Ronan has proof the border markers were moved deliberately, it doesn't just embarrass Cade. It exposes his father. It exposes the whole arrangement that brought you into this pack in the first place, and if that comes out, do you understand what happens to Thornwood standing with every other pack in the region? You knew, I said slowly, understanding dawning cold and clear. You knew about the debt marriage. About what really happened to my parents. Bianca's face went very still. I knew there was a debt. I didn't ask questions I didn't want answered. That's the difference between us, Wren. I know when not to look too closely at things that don't concern me. It concerns me. It's my entire life. Your life was never the point. Something raw and desperate crept into her voice now, the composed cruelty cracking to show what lived underneath it. Cade's father promised me to Cade when we were children, before your parents' debt ever came into it. Before you ever existed in his plans. And then he brought you home instead, a stranger, a debt payment. And I have spent 7 years watching him fail to mark either of us, because some part of him has never been able to choose between the arrangement he was promised and the guilt he apparently feels over you. I stood frozen in the moonlit study, the folder forgotten between us, absorbing a version of events I had never once considered in 7 years of assuming Bianca's cruelty came from simple, uncomplicated malice. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and unexpected. For the first time, I understood the shape of Bianca's cruelty, not simple malice, but 7 years of her own humiliation, watching an unmarked wife occupy space she believed had been promised to her since childhood. That doesn't excuse what you're doing right now, I said. No, she agreed, and something in her voice had gone flat, resigned. But I've spent 7 years losing to a version of you that stood by doorways and never fought back. I don't know how to lose to the version standing in front of me now. Footsteps sounded in the hallway behind us, guards, alerted at last, drawn by voices in a study that should have been empty. Bianca's eyes went wide with panic, and in the space of a heartbeat, I made a decision I would spend the rest of the night questioning. Put the folder back, I whispered. Now, I'll handle the guards. Chapter 14. The old bloodline. I lay awake long after the guard's footsteps faded down the hall, turning the night over in my mind, replaying Bianca's raw, unguarded confession against 7 years of her carefully aimed cruelty. It was strange to discover that the woman who had made my life smallest of all was, underneath everything, just as trapped by Cade's father's arrangements as I had been. I never fully understood why I protected her that night. Perhaps it was recognition, 2 women shaped by the same man's failure to choose, punished in different ways for the same absence. Perhaps it was simpler than that. 7 years of being underestimated had taught me that mercy, offered when no one expects it, is its own kind of power. I told the guards I'd heard a noise and come to investigate, found nothing, and sent them back to their posts with an apology for the false alarm, my heart still hammering hard enough that I was certain, for one terrible second, they'd hear it too. Bianca was gone by the time I turned around, the folder and treaty back exactly where they belonged. No evidence of the night's events beyond the 2 of us knowing what had almost happened. She didn't thank me. I hadn't expected her to. What I hadn't expected was Ronan, waiting in the hallway when I finally returned to my room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You covered for her," he said. My stomach dropped. "You saw." I heard the whole thing. I was 2 doors down, working late. He studied me for a long moment. Most people in your position would have used that information as a weapon. Exposed her. Watched her fall. You had every reason to. I thought about it, I admitted. For about the length of time it took her to put the folder back. Then I thought about what it would actually feel like, watching someone destroyed over a decision made out of fear, when I've spent 7 years being punished for decisions that were never even mine to make in the first place. "She's drowning in the same arrangement that nearly drowned me," I said. I don't need to push her under to prove I finally learned how to swim. Something shifted in Ronan's expression, not just admiration, though that was there too, but a kind of recognition that went deeper than the physical pull I'd felt from him since the stairwell, as though he were seeing, in real time, the exact shape of the woman his instincts had already recognized weeks before his mind fully caught up. "That's the divine blood in you," he said quietly. "Mercy that costs something and gives it anyway." I've read enough of the old stories to know that's exactly how they described the moon goddess's children. Not powerful because they could destroy their enemies. Powerful because they chose not to, even when they easily could. "I don't feel like a story," I said, wrapping my arms around myself against the hallway's late-night chill. "I feel like a woman who's spent 7 years learning that mercy usually just gets taken advantage of, and I'm terrified I just handed Bianca exactly the weapon she needs to hurt me again." "Maybe," Ronan said gently. "Or maybe you just planted something in her that Cade's whole household never once thought to plant in 7 years. The possibility that she doesn't have to keep being the version of herself that hurts people to survive." "I don't feel powerful," I admitted. "I feel like I've spent 7 years learning to be small, and now everything about me is getting louder, and I don't know how to hold all of it at once." "You don't have to hold it alone." He reached out, slow enough that I could have stepped back, and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my jaw. "I know we've known each other 4 days. I know that should feel impossible. But I have never in my life felt what I feel when I'm standing near you, Wren, and I don't think it's only the blood in your veins that's doing that to me." The pendant warmed against my skin, not with warning this time, but with something that felt, unmistakably, like approval. "Cade is still my husband," I said quietly, though even as I said it, the words felt like they belonged to a life I was already leaving behind. "Cade let a debt contract stand between you and the truth for 7 years, Ronan said. Cade let you serve his household like a stranger instead of asking one single question about who you might actually be. Whatever bond you two have, Wren, it was never a marriage built on choosing each other. I would like the chance, when you're ready, to show you what that actually looks like." I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice to hold steady. But I didn't step away either, and that, more than any words, told us both everything we needed to know. Chapter 15. Cade's Suspicion. We returned to Thornwood 3 days later, the treaty signed, the border dispute resolved, and something unspoken shifting in every glance Cade cast my way for the entire drive home. Bianca rode in silence for most of it, staring out the window at passing hills, and I found myself, oddly, missing the easy cruelty of the woman who had at least always told me plainly where I stood. He waited until we were alone in the study that evening, Bianca conveniently absent, to finally say what had clearly been building since Ashgrave's dinner hall. "You and Ronan," he said, not quite a question, turning a glass of untouched whiskey slowly between his fingers, as if the words themselves needed careful handling. "There is no me and Ronan," I said, though the words felt less true every day. "There's a treaty negotiation where I was finally allowed to sit at the table instead of standing by the door." I saw the way he looked at you. Cade's voice had an edge I hadn't heard directed at me before. Not quite jealousy, something rawer, older, the sound of a man watching something he'd never valued get claimed by someone who clearly did. The way he looked back. "Would you have preferred I keep standing by the door, Cade? Is that the version of me you actually want back? Because that woman spent 7 years disappearing for your comfort, and I don't think either of us can pretend that arrangement was working." He flinched at that, a small, involuntary movement, and for a moment I almost regretted the bluntness of it. Almost. 7 years of gentleness had gotten me nothing but 7 more years of the same silence, and I had stopped believing gentleness was a debt I still owed him. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the unlit fireplace. "I don't know what I want anymore. I know that watching you at that table, watching Ronan defer to you, watching you dismantle a decade of border theft with nothing but memory and nerve, I saw someone I don't think I ever actually let myself see before. And I don't know what to do with the fact that it took another man noticing you for me to finally look." "You don't get to be jealous of Ronan, Cade," I said, sharper than I intended. "Jealousy requires having claimed something in the first place, and you made very sure, for 7 years, never to claim anything about me at all." "That's not a compliment, Cade. That's an indictment." "I know." His jaw tightened. "Rasmus told me what he told you. About your mother. About the debt. I should have told you the truth years ago, the moment I learned it myself, instead of hiding behind my father's silence." "When did you learn it?" He hesitated, and the hesitation told me everything before he finally answered. "The week before our wedding. My father told me exactly what the debt was for, and told me the marriage was the only way to keep watch over you in case whatever came for your parents ever came looking for their daughter too." 7 years. He had known for 7 years and let me believe I was simply unwanted, simply unworthy of a mark, simply the debt payment wife nobody had bothered explaining anything to. "You let me believe you didn't want me," I said, my voice shaking now, all the careful control of 7 years finally giving way. "You let me stand by doorways and eat cold dinners and watch Bianca take my place, and the entire time you knew the truth and said nothing." "I didn't mark you because I was afraid," Cade said, the words coming faster now, like a dam finally breaking. "Not afraid of you. Afraid of what marking you would mean if whatever hunted your parents ever traced you here. A mark binds us, Wren, truly binds us, pack law and blood both, and I thought if I kept you unmarked, kept the marriage more like a shelter than a claim, I could protect you without exposing you." "That's not protection, Cade. That's 7 years of choosing my safety without ever once asking if it was a trade I would have made myself." He had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. I left him alone in the study, in the dark, and walked out into the night air, where the moon, finally, for the first time in weeks, visible and full, hung low and silver over Thornwood territory, watching. "He is not lying," the voice said softly. "Fear made him a coward. It did not make him your enemy. But you're allowed, little one, to decide that the difference no longer matters to you." Chapter 16. Bianca's Trap. Bianca cornered me 3 days later in the kitchen, her composure fully rebuilt, whatever vulnerability she'd shown me at Ashgrave carefully locked away again. She'd changed back into the polished, unbothered version of herself within a day of returning home, as if the confession in Ronan's study belonged to a different woman entirely, one she had no further use for now that Thornwood's walls surrounded her again. "Cade told me about your little conversation," she said, arranging herself against the counter with practiced ease. "About the debt. About how he's suddenly full of regret for 7 years of very reasonable caution. Reasonable caution has a name, Bianca. It's called lying to your wife for 7 years. Careful," she said, smiling without warmth. examining her nails as if the conversation cost her nothing at all. "You're not his wife in any way that matters, remember? You said so yourself, the night of the rejection." "I was there. Everyone was there. Things change. Do they?" She studied her nails, unbothered. "I've been thinking about what you said in Ashgrave's hallway. About how you'd rather be seen through than unseen. Noble sentiment. Doesn't change the fact that Ronan Ashgrave is an alpha king with a kingdom to protect, and kingdoms don't survive on romantic feelings toward a housekeeper with an interesting bloodline. The moment your usefulness to him ends, so will his interest. Is that concern for me, or fear for yourself?" She didn't answer immediately, and in the silence that followed, I caught something flicker across her face that looked, for just a moment, uncomfortably like the same fear I'd carried standing in that great hall the night of my rejection. The fear of a woman who understood exactly how quickly her position could be taken from her by someone else's better claim. Something flickered across her face, the same rawness from the Ashgrave hallway, quickly smoothed over. "I've spent 7 years positioning myself to finally become Luna of this pack. I am not going to lose that position to a treaty table performance and a rival king's temporary fascination. Then do something about it that doesn't involve stealing documents from Ronan's study," I said, watching her flinch at the reminder that I still held that secret. "Or is your plan simply to keep hoping I disappear back into the doorway I used to occupy?" "My plan," she said, voice suddenly hard, "is to make sure the Elders' Council hears about exactly what you are before Ronan Ashgrave decides your bloodline is worth building an alliance around. Divine blood isn't a gift in every pack's eyes, Wren. Some of the old families still remember the wars fought over exactly what you're becoming. I imagine they'd be very interested to learn Thornwood has been harboring one this whole time." I felt the blood drain from my face despite myself. I had spent barely 2 weeks even beginning to understand what I was, and Bianca was already prepared to weaponize it against me before I'd had the chance to understand it myself. "You'd risk starting a war across the entire region just to keep your position." "I'd risk it," she said, "because I've watched what happens to women in this world who wait patiently for someone else to protect their position instead. I learned that lesson from you, Wren, whether you meant to teach it or not." The threat landed cold and precise, exactly calculated to hurt. "You'd expose me. To protect your position." "I'd survive," she said simply. "That's what 7 years of losing to an unmarked wife teaches a woman, Wren. Survival stops caring about fairness eventually." She left me standing in the kitchen with my hands shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the dawning understanding that whatever peace I'd started to build at Ashgrave was about to collide, hard, with every danger Elder Rasmus and the voice in my head had been quietly warning me about since the night I walked out of that hall in the rain. I pressed both palms flat against the cold counter until the shaking eased, forcing myself to think clearly rather than react from fear the way 7 years of training had taught me to. That evening, I packed a small bag, tucked the pendant beneath my collar, and made a decision that had been building since the moment Bianca's threat landed. I couldn't protect myself by staying small in a house that had never once protected me back. I needed to understand what I actually was, fully, before anyone else decided that answer for me. I needed to find the temple Elder Rasmus had described. And I needed to go before the Elders' Council, or anyone else, arrived at Thornwood's door looking for a reason to hunt what I was becoming. Chapter 17. Running from the pack. I left before dawn, while the house was still dark, taking nothing but the small bag I'd packed, the pendant warm against my skin, and a map of Ashgrave's border territory I'd memorized during the treaty negotiations. I left no note. There was no one left in that house I trusted enough to explain myself to, and some part of me, cowardly or not, didn't want to give Cade the chance to talk me out of going before I'd even started. The forest swallowed me within the first mile, and I let it, moving deeper into wild land that belonged to no pack, guided by nothing but the pull of the pendant and the voice growing steadily louder with every step. Birdsong fell away the further I went, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears, as though the trees themselves were holding still to listen for whatever was coming. "You're close," it said, threaded with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Closer than you have ever been." But you are not the only one who felt the temple wake, little one. Others will have felt it too. I didn't understand the warning until I heard the howl behind me. Not a Thornwood howl, not Ashgrave's either, but something unfamiliar, hungry, tracking. I ran. 7 years of quiet, careful movement through Cade's household had never prepared me for actually running for my life, but some instinct older than memory took over, guiding my feet over roots and through brush I couldn't fully see in the pre-dawn dark. The howl grew closer. I heard a second voice join it, then a third, and understood with a cold drop in my stomach that I was being hunted by something coordinated, something that had been waiting for exactly this. For me to leave the relative safety of Thornwood's walls and Ashgrave's guards, alone, unprotected, exposed. My lungs burned with the effort of running full out across uneven ground I couldn't fully see, branches tearing at my sleeves, mud sucking at my boots with every stride, and still I pushed harder, some animal part of me finally, fully awake to the fact that stopping meant dying. I broke into a clearing and nearly collapsed with relief at the sight of the moss-covered stone circle from my first night at Ashgrave, the same ancient site where the silver light had risen to meet me, though I'd run in the wrong direction entirely to have reached it. Another impossibility I didn't have time to question. The wolves broke through the tree line behind me as I stumbled into the circle's center. 3 of them, coats a mottled gray-brown I didn't recognize from any pack I knew, eyes wrong somehow. Too flat, too hungry, moving with the coordinated precision of trained hunters rather than territorial wolves defending land. They spread into a loose triangle around the circle's edge with the unhurried patience of predators who had done this exact thing many times before and expected no different an outcome today. Hunters, the voice said, cold with recognition. The same bloodline that took your mother. They have been waiting a long time for another chance. I had no weapon beyond the strange power flickering unreliably beneath my skin, no training beyond 7 years of learning how to read a room for danger rather than fight my way out of one. Whatever came next, I understood with sudden, terrible clarity, would not be decided by anything I already knew how to do. I had nowhere left to run. I turned to face them, the pendant blazing hot and bright against my chest, my veins lighting silver beneath my skin exactly as they had the first night in the circle, and for the first time, I didn't fight the sensation. I let it rise. Whatever you came here for, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, you should have brought more than 3. The lead wolf snarled and lunged. Chapter 18. The Wolf King's Territory. I don't fully remember what happened in the next few seconds. Time seemed to thicken, slow, the way it does in the worst moments of a life, every detail suddenly sharp enough to cut. I remember the silver light rising off my skin in a wave that met the lead wolf mid-leap and sent him crashing sideways into the stone circle's edge, yelping in pain, his coat smoking faintly where the light had touched him. I remember the second wolf hesitating, suddenly uncertain, and the third breaking into a growl that sounded almost like fear. Whatever training had brought them this far into Ashgrave territory clearly hadn't prepared them for a target who fought back with light instead of teeth. I remember, distantly, the sound of a much larger wolf crashing through the tree line behind them, Ronan, fully shifted, a massive dark shape moving with lethal speed, closing the distance before the hunters could regroup. He took the second wolf down before it could react, and the third fled into the trees rather than face both of us together, leaving the first wolf still smoking faintly on the ground, injured but alive, staring up at me with an expression that had shifted entirely from predatory hunger to something like fear. Ronan shifted back to human form, breathing hard, bare-chested and streaked with the other wolf's blood, and was at my side in 3 strides, hands framing my face, checking for injury with an intensity that told me exactly how frightened he'd been. "How did you know where I was?" I asked, my voice shaking now that the adrenaline was draining away, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me in a way they hadn't been even in the thick of the fight itself. I felt the wards on this circle wake for the second time in a week. I've had guards watching for it since the night we first stood here together. His jaw was tight with residual fear. "You ran from Thornwood alone, Wren. Into open territory, with hunters who have clearly been watching for exactly this opportunity. Do you understand what could have happened? Bianca threatened to expose me to the Elders' Council." I panicked. I thought if I could just understand what I was before anyone else decided it for me. You could have come to me. His hands were still framing my face, gentle despite the urgency in his voice. You could have come to Ashgrave. I would have kept you safe while you figured out the rest. I've spent 7 years being kept somewhere for my own safety, I said quietly. I didn't want to trade one version of that for another, even with you. Something in his expression softened, understanding replacing frustration. That's fair. I'm sorry. I forget sometimes that safety offered without choice isn't safety at all. It's just a prettier cage. The injured hunter wolf on the ground let out a low whimper, and Ronan's guards, arriving finally through the trees, moved to secure him for questioning. Who sent you? Ronan demanded, crouching beside the wolf, voice gone hard and commanding in a way I hadn't heard from him before, every trace of the gentleman from the stone circle replaced entirely by an alpha king prepared to do whatever this moment required. The hunter shifted back to human form, an older man with cold eyes and a scar running the length of his jaw. He looked at me with something like recognition. Celine's daughter. We wondered if the bloodline had truly died out or simply gone into hiding. 11 years of searching, and here you stand. You killed my parents, I said, the words coming out steadier than I expected. We killed a woman who should have surrendered her power to the circle of ash willingly, rather than hide it in a mortal marriage and a child she pretended could stay ordinary forever. His eyes held mine, unrepentant. The circle does not forget unclaimed divine blood, girl. We have been patient. We will not be patient forever. Ronan's guards dragged him away for questioning, but his final words followed me the rest of that day, cold and certain, a warning I couldn't unhear. Others are coming, the voice said grimly. The temple must finish what it started, little one, before the circle of ash finds you again with more than 3 hunters at their back. Chapter 19. Ronan's warning. Ronan brought me back to Ashgrave that night, and this time, no one questioned the arrangement. Cade was informed by messenger, a curt notification that his wife would be remaining at Ashgrave territory under Ronan's protection until the threat against her was fully understood. I slept fitfully in the same guest room as before, waking twice from dreams of smoking fur and cold gray eyes, and each time found the pendant warm and steady against my sternum, a small, constant reassurance that I was no longer facing any of it alone. I expected fury from Cade. What I got instead, 2 days later, was Cade himself, arriving alone, without guards, without Bianca, standing at Ashgrave's gate with an expression I hadn't seen on him since our wedding day. I need to see her, he told Ronan's guards, and something in his voice must have convinced them, because they let him through. He looked, I thought when I finally saw him crossing the garden, like a man who had spent 2 straight nights unable to sleep, hollow around the eyes in a way 7 years of careful distance had never once produced in him before. I met him in the same garden where Ronan had first held my face in his hands, checking for injuries after the hunter attack, and the contrast wasn't lost on either of us. You could have died, Cade said, without preamble, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept since word of the attack reached Thornwood. 3 hunters, alone in the woods, and I was 3 hours away arguing with Bianca about elder council politics instead of noticing my wife had disappeared before dawn. I'm not your wife in any way that matters, remember? The words came out sharper than I intended, old wounds surfacing. I know what I said. His jaw tightened. I have spent 7 years saying things I didn't mean because meaning them felt more dangerous than the lie. I told myself if I never really claimed you, I could never really fail you. And then you nearly died in a forest because I was too much of a coward to protect you properly for 7 straight years, and I finally understood how badly that logic had failed both of us. What do you want, Cade? I want the chance to actually be your husband, he said, quiet, raw. Not the arrangement. Not the debt. I want to earn a mark I should have given you years ago, if you'll ever let me try. He reached for my hand, hesitant, as if unsure whether the gesture would still be welcome, and I let him take it, though I felt none of the certainty I once might have felt at exactly this moment, years earlier, when his touch alone would have been enough to convince me of anything. The offer landed strangely in my chest, not quite the relief it might have been a month earlier, before Ashgrave's gates and Ronan's steady presence had shown me an entirely different version of what being chosen could feel like. I studied Cade's face, searching for the boy from our wedding morning, and found him there, finally, buried under 7 years of fear he was only now learning to set down. I looked at him for a long moment, the boy from the altar, the man who had let fear cost me 7 years of belonging, standing in front of me now with something that looked, finally, like genuine remorse. I don't know if I still want that, I said honestly. I don't know if 7 years of silence is something an apology can undo, even a real one. I thought of all the small moments across those 7 years that might have changed something, if either of us had been braver. The winter he'd caught a fever and I'd sat up 3 nights nursing him back to health. Both of us too proud to acknowledge the tenderness of it afterward. The summer festival where he'd almost asked me to dance before Bianca's father intercepted him with pack business that conveniently required his immediate attention. The countless ordinary dinners where a single honest sentence from either of us might have cracked the whole careful arrangement wide open years before a rival alpha king ever had to do it for us. We had both, in our own ways, chosen the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, again and again, until the lie became simply how we lived. I'm not asking you to decide today, he said again, quieter now. I'm only asking that the door not be closed yet. I know I haven't earned an open one. I'm not asking you to decide today. He held my gaze. I'm asking you to let me try. To let me be someone worth choosing instead of someone you settle for because a contract said you had to. Behind us, I felt Ronan's presence before I saw him, watching the exchange from the garden's edge with an expression carefully neutral, though I could feel the tension radiating off him. The Elders' Council has been notified about the hunter attack, Ronan said, joining us, his tone measured but firm. They'll want to convene. And Wren needs to find this temple before the Circle of Ash regroups, which means she needs protection and preparation, not a domestic reconciliation happening in real time in my garden. Cade's eyes moved between us, understanding dawning slow and painful. You care for her. I do, Ronan said simply, without apology. I understand that complicates things. I don't intend to pretend otherwise to make this easier for you. The two alphas stood in silence, some old, wordless negotiation happening between them that I wasn't fully part of, and I realized, watching them, that whatever happened next, with Cade, with Ronan, with the temple and the Circle of Ash, and the divine blood waking in my veins, the choice, for the first time in 7 years, was entirely mine to make. Chapter 20. The Moon Remembers. That night, unable to sleep, I walked alone to the stone circle one final time, needing distance from both men, from the pull of 2 very different futures, from 7 years of choices that had never once been my own to make. The guards let me pass without question this time, some quiet understanding having settled between us since the hunter attack, an unspoken agreement that whatever called me to that clearing deserved to be answered rather than guarded against. The moon hung full and bright above the clearing, and the moment I stepped inside the ring of ancient stones, the silver light rose to meet me stronger than it ever had before, wrapping around me like an embrace I'd been waiting my entire life to receive. The vision came without warning. The clearing dissolved around me the way a dream does, gently, without any sense of falling, and in its place I stood inside a memory that felt somehow more solid than the ground I'd actually been standing on a moment before. I saw my mother, young, laughing, standing in this exact circle beside a woman whose face was made of moonlight itself, no features I could fully hold onto, only an overwhelming sense of warmth and power and love. I saw my mother receive the crescent pendant from that radiant figure's hands. I saw her walk away from this place carrying a secret she would guard with her life, choosing an ordinary marriage, an ordinary house, an ordinary daughter's name. All of it built to keep me hidden from exactly the kind of danger that had found me in these woods days before. I saw the night she died, not a border skirmish, but an ambush, the Circle of Ash's hunters closing in on a house that had no way to defend itself against wolves who wanted her power claimed or destroyed. No in-between. I watched my father die first, trying to buy her the seconds she needed. His last act, one of a man who understood exactly what he was protecting even if he'd never fully understood what she was. I watched her scream his name once, and then go terrifyingly, purposefully calm, gathering whatever power she had left for the one act that mattered more to her than her own survival. I saw her final act, a spell, ancient and desperate, that scattered her power into hiding rather than let it fall into the circle's hands, sealing it inside a sleeping child who would not wake to what she carried until the timing and the danger and the choice were finally, fully her own. "I am so sorry," the voice said, and for the first time it did not sound distant or ancient. It sounded like a mother's grief, close and aching. I could not save her. I could only promise her that I would watch over what she left behind until you were strong enough to survive what waking up would cost you. Tears came then, unexpected and overwhelming. 25 years of grief and loneliness finally finding somewhere safe to land. I had spent so long believing myself entirely alone in the world, an orphan with no family and no birthright beyond a debt contract, and here, impossibly, was proof that I had been watched over the entire time by someone who loved me before I even understood what love from a stranger could mean. "You're the moon goddess," I said, understanding breaking over me like dawn. "You're not just watching me. You're your grandmother in every way that has ever mattered," the voice said softly. "Your mother was my daughter, born of my blood 100 years before she ever met your father, ageless until she chose otherwise, hidden across a dozen mortal lifetimes to keep the circle of ash from ever finding a bloodline they have hunted for 3 centuries. And you, Wren, are the last of that line. The last daughter of the moon." The scale of it should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, kneeling in that ancient circle with dawn light beginning to touch the treetops, I felt something settle into place that had been unsettled my entire life, the sense, however faint, that I had always belonged to something larger than the small, overlooked existence Thornwood had assigned me. The silver light enveloped me fully, warm and vast, and for one impossible, radiant moment, I felt the full weight of what I truly was settle into my bones, not a rejected wife, not an unmarked Luna, not a debt paid in marriage to a pack that had never valued her, but something ancient, something powerful, something that had been sleeping inside an ordinary, overlooked woman for 25 years, waiting only for grief and fury and love to finally crack the seal keeping her hidden. "The circle of ash will not stop hunting you now that they know you're awake," the goddess said, her voice steady with warning even through the tenderness. "You must come to the true temple, beyond even Ashgrave's borders, to finish what your mother's sacrifice began. Only there can you claim the fullness of what you are, before the circle finds you again with an army instead of 3 scouts." I opened my eyes to find dawn breaking pink and gold over the clearing, my whole body thrumming with power I was only beginning to understand, and somewhere beyond the tree line, faint but unmistakable, I felt it, the true temple, calling my name across the miles like it had been waiting 100 years for exactly this morning to arrive. Chapter 21. The Temple Gate. Ronan insisted on coming with me. Cade insisted on the same, and for once the 2 alphas agreed on something without posturing over it, both of them recognizing, I think, that the danger ahead had nothing to do with pack rivalry and everything to do with keeping me alive long enough to finish what my mother started. Elder Rasmus wanted to come as well, until Ronan gently pointed out that his knees would not survive the terrain, and the old wolf conceded the point with more grace than I expected, settling instead for a long embrace and a whispered blessing in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood anyway. "Bring her home safely," he told Ronan quietly, as if I weren't standing close enough to hear it, and Ronan answered with a single, solemn nod that carried more weight than any formal vow could have. We left at first light, a small party, Ronan, Cade, 2 of Ronan's most trusted guards, and me, following the pull in my chest deeper into territory that belonged to no pack, no treaty, no map any of them had ever charted. No one spoke much during the ride. The forest around us grew steadily quieter with every mile, birdsong falling away entirely by the time the trees began to thin, as if the land itself understood we were approaching something it had long ago agreed to protect in silence. The temple revealed itself slowly, the way sacred places often do, the trees thinning by degrees until we stood before a structure carved from pale stone that seemed to hold its own soft light, untouched by centuries of moss or weather, as if time itself moved differently within its boundary. Vines that should have long since claimed the stonework grew instead in careful, deliberate patterns around its edges, as though even the forest understood this place was not meant to be reclaimed by anything ordinary. Even the horses grew uneasy at the tree line and refused to go further, and none of the guards argued the point, tying them off without a word and following the rest of us on foot instead. The last stretch of ground before the clearing felt different beneath my boots, softer somehow, as though the earth itself had been waiting a very long time for feet like mine to finally cross it again. "I've hunted this territory my whole life," Ronan said quietly, staring up at the temple's arched entrance, something like wonder softening the usual command in his voice. "I never once found this place. I don't think I was meant to until now." Cade said nothing at all, staring up at the pale stone with an expression I couldn't fully read, and I wondered whether he was thinking of his father, of the debt contract, of everything he'd let 7 years of silence bury rather than risk uncovering something exactly this large. One of Ronan's guards crossed himself in some old gesture of reverence I didn't recognize, and even the usually unshakable Ashgrave soldiers kept their voices to whispers, as if the temple itself demanded a kind of quiet none of them needed to be told to observe. The air itself felt thicker here, charged with something ancient and patient, waiting. The pendant at my throat blazed bright as I approached the entrance, and the temple's great stone doors, untouched by hands in what looked like 100 years, groaned open at my approach without anyone touching them, ancient hinges singing a low, resonant note that felt less like rust and more like recognition. "Wren." Cade's voice, low with something between awe and fear. "Whatever's in there, are you certain you're ready?" "No," I admitted. "But I don't think readiness is something I get to wait for anymore." 7 years of waiting for the right moment, the right permission, the right circumstances had taught me only that the right moment rarely announces itself in advance. Sometimes you simply had to walk through the door in front of you, ready or not, and trust that whatever waited on the other side had already decided you were ready even if you hadn't decided it yourself. Cade reached out and squeezed my hand once, briefly, before I stepped forward, an old, familiar gesture from the earliest days of our marriage that neither of us had used in years, back when such small kindnesses still came easily and often between us. I let myself take the small comfort of it without reading anything more into it than what it was. Two people who had shared a complicated history, wishing each other well at the edge of something neither of them fully understood. I stepped through the doors alone, some instinct telling me this part of the journey belonged to me and me only, and behind me, I heard both men move to follow before the doors swung shut between us, sealing me inside with a soft finality that left no room for argument. The interior was vast, far larger than the outside had suggested, lit by shafts of moonlight falling through openings in a ceiling I couldn't fully see. At the center stood a reflecting pool, silver and still, and standing at its edge, waiting, was a figure made of moonlight-given form, the same radiant, faceless warmth I had seen in my vision, now solid enough to reach toward me with a hand that felt, when it closed around mine, entirely real. "Grandmother," I said, testing the word, and felt it settle into place like it had always belonged there. "Daughter of my daughter," the goddess said, her voice no longer distant, filling the temple with a warmth I felt in my bones. "You have crossed further than I dared hope you would, in far less time than I feared it would take. Come, let me finally show you everything your mother died protecting." Chapter 22. Blood of the Goddess. The reflecting pool showed me everything. The water didn't simply show images the way a mirror does. It pulled me into them, let me stand inside memories that weren't mine and feel them anyway. Grief and joy both landing in my chest as if I had lived every one of those centuries myself instead of merely witnessing them in a few suspended minutes beside an ancient pool. I saw generations of my bloodlines stretching back further than Thornwood's oldest recorded histories, women born of moonlight and mortal love, hidden across centuries. Each one a guardian of a power the Circle of Ash had spent 300 years trying to claim or extinguish, depending on which served their ambitions better in a given age. I saw the Circle's true purpose, not a rival pack, but an ancient order of wolves who believed divine blood, properly harvested and bound, could grant them power over the moon's cycles themselves, control over every wolf pack's shifting, an authority no Alpha King or Council of Elders could ever hope to challenge. I watched their founders make that first terrible bargain centuries before Thornwood existed, watched the order grow patient and methodical across generations, hunting rumors of divine bloodlines across a dozen territories long before my mother was ever born. I saw my mother's final year, hunted, exhausted, choosing exile and an ordinary life specifically to keep that power out of the Circle's hands. Loving my father with a fierceness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with finally choosing a life for herself, however briefly she was allowed to keep it. I watched her hold me as an infant on a porch somewhere I didn't recognize, humming a lullaby I suddenly, achingly remembered in full, every note of it flooding back after 14 years of only half remembering the melody. "Why did you let her die?" I asked, the old grief finally finding words. Years of unspoken anger at a universe that had taken both my parents, finally finding a target that could actually answer for it. "If you're truly a goddess, why didn't you save her?" "Power like mine does not work the way mortals wish it did," the goddess said, sorrow threading through every syllable. "I can guide. I can watch. I can plant a seed of protection in a sleeping child and wait a lifetime for it to bloom. I cannot simply reach into the mortal world and undo what mortal cruelty chooses to do. Your mother's death was not my failure to act. It was the Circle's choice to hunt, and I have grieved it every day since, exactly as you have." I let the anger drain out of me slowly, not because it had fully resolved, but because I understood, standing in that ancient light, that some griefs simply had to be carried rather than solved. My grandmother's grief and mine were, in that moment, the same weight, shared across a bond neither distance nor centuries had managed to sever. The reflecting pool shifted, showing me now not the past, but a glimpse of what waited ahead. The Circle of Ash gathering in numbers I hadn't imagined, dozens of hunters, moving with purpose toward Ashgrave's borders, drawn by the same awakening that had drawn me to this temple. "They're coming," I said, cold understanding settling over me. "They have always been coming, since the moment your power woke in Thornwood's Great Hall the night you finally walked away from a marriage that never should have bound you." The goddess's hand tightened gently around mine. "But you are not the frightened, hidden child your mother protected any longer, Wren. You are ready to become what she always hoped. One day, you would have the chance to be." Light gathered around us, silver and vast, and I felt the full weight of my bloodline settle into my body, not an invasion, but a homecoming, power that had always belonged to me finally allowed to fill every corner of who I was. "Rise, daughter of my daughter," the goddess said, her voice carrying through the temple like a bell. "Rise as Luna of the moon itself, and go finish what 300 years of hiding was always meant to build toward." Chapter 23. Nyx's Daughter. When the temple doors opened again, I walked out changed in ways no one who saw me could fail to notice. The sun had moved further across the sky than the time I remembered spending inside should have allowed, as if the temple existed slightly outside the ordinary flow of hours, and my legs felt strange beneath me, both lighter and more solid than they had ever felt in 25 years of ordinary living. My eyes had gone permanently, subtly silver, a shift no longer temporary or triggered by moonlight alone. The pendant had fused seamlessly into my skin, no longer a separate object, but a mark, visible at my collarbone, unmistakably divine. And the power that had flickered and stuttered in me for weeks now sat steady and vast beneath my skin, controlled, waiting, entirely mine. Ronan and Cade both went very still as I emerged, their expressions caught somewhere between awe and something close to reverence, and even the guards who had waited outside the temple doors dropped instinctively into a half-bow before catching themselves. "Wren," Cade breathed. "What are you?" I'm exactly what Elder Rasmus suspected the day he smelled my mother's scent underneath mine, I said. I'm the last daughter of Nyx, goddess of the moon. And I have about a day, maybe less, before the circle of ash arrives at Ashgrave's borders with more wolves than either of your packs have ever fought at once. Ronan's joy tightened, already shifting into commander mode. How many? Dozens. Trained hunters, coordinated, hungry for exactly the kind of power I'm now carrying. I met his eyes, steady despite the fear underneath. I need both your packs. Not divided by treaty lines or old rivalries. United, or none of us survive what's coming. Neither alpha argued the point, and something about their easy, immediate agreement told me exactly how much the battlefield at Ashgrave's gates and the hunters in the forest had already reshaped their understanding of what genuinely mattered. Thornwood will stand with you, Cade said immediately, no hesitation in his voice for the first time in longer than I could remember. Whatever that requires. Ashgrave as well, Ronan said, though his eyes lingered on me with a question neither of us had time to answer yet. We'll need Elder Rasmus. He'll know how to rally the older wolves who still remember the old wars against the Circle. Cade nodded, already turning practical matters over in his mind, and for a moment the two alphas worked in a rare, easy sync, neither wasting breath on the old rivalry that had shaped every prior meeting between them. We rode back toward Ashgrave territory as the sun climbed high overhead, and word of my transformation seemed to travel faster than our horses, faster than any messenger, wolves along the border stopping to stare, murmuring my name. The story of the rejected Luna already twisting, in the space of a single day, into something closer to legend. Children ran alongside the road for a stretch, wide-eyed, until their parents called them back, and I caught more than one older wolf pressing a hand to their chest in a gesture of respect I didn't yet have a name for, but somehow understood anyway. By the time we reached Ashgrave's gates, Elder Rasmus himself was waiting, having traveled through the night on word of the temple's awakening, his old eyes wet with tears I didn't fully understand until he spoke. You look exactly like her, he said, voice breaking. Exactly like Celine, the day she left Thornwood territory for the last time, before the world took her from us both. He bowed his head, deeper than an elder should bow to anyone. My Luna. My apologies, 25 years too late, for every year we let you grow up believing you were ordinary. You couldn't have known, I said gently, helping him rise. I suspected. I said nothing out of my own fear for far too long. His eyes met mine, fierce despite his age. I will not make that mistake again. Whatever the circle of ash brings to Ashgrave's border, they will find every wolf who remembers your mother standing between them and her daughter. Chapter 24. The Truth Cade Buried. That night, as Ashgrave's war council gathered to plan our defense, Cade found me alone on the terrace, staring out at the mountains where, somewhere beyond the tree line, the circle of ash was closing in. Below us, torches moved along the outer walls where guards doubled their patrols, and the low murmur of two packs preparing for war carried up through the cold mountain air like a held breath the whole estate seemed to be sharing. There's something else I need to tell you, he said, and something in his voice made me turn to face him fully, the last of the day's light fading behind him over mountains that still felt foreign under my feet. Something I should have told you the day Rasmus first mentioned it, instead of burying it with everything else. What is it? My father didn't just arrange our marriage to protect you from the circle. Cade's jaw tightened, the words clearly costing him. He also made a private arrangement with them. A promise that if the circle ever came for you, Thornwood would not stand in their way, in exchange for peace along our northern border for a generation. The words landed like a physical blow. I gripped the terrace railing to steady myself, the mountain view blurring at the edges. So the marriage was never protection at all. It was a holding pen. Somewhere convenient to keep me until your father's real bargain came due. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. Your father sold me to them. He sold your safety for pack security, yes. Cade's voice was raw with old shame. I found the agreement in his private papers after he died. I never told you. I told myself it didn't matter because I intended to protect you regardless, whatever my father had promised. But I never marked you, Wren, and I think some part of me knew that leaving you unmarked meant leaving a door open, a technicality my father could point to later if the circle ever came asking why Thornwood hadn't honored its word. Fury rose in me, hot and sharp, the divine power beneath my skin responding to the emotion with a flare of silver light I had to consciously will back under control. You knew this and let me walk into these woods believing Thornwood would simply protect me. You let me believe the danger was only ever external. I know. He didn't flinch from my anger, didn't look away. I have spent 7 years making cowardly choices and calling them caution, Wren, and I am done doing that. I'm telling you now because you deserve the whole truth before this war starts, not because it's convenient, but because you asked me once to stop lying by omission, and I finally understand what that actually costs a person to do. I studied him for a long moment, the fury slowly settling into something colder, clearer. Will Thornwood honor your father's agreement? If it comes to it, if the circle demands Thornwood step aside. My voice came out steadier than I felt, though my hands, pressed flat against the cold terrace railing, betrayed exactly how much the question actually cost me to ask. No. The answer came without hesitation, immediate and certain. I will burn that agreement myself before I let a single wolf in my pack stand aside while the circle comes for you. Whatever I failed to be for the past 7 years, Wren, I will not fail you in the fight that's actually coming. There was something almost desperate in the way he said it, a man trying to outrun 7 years of accumulated failure in the space of a single promise, and though I didn't yet trust the promise fully, I found myself, cautiously, willing to let him try to keep it. Something in his voice, finally, after 7 years, sounded like the truth. I don't forgive you, I said quietly. Not yet. Maybe not ever fully. But I believe you mean that. That's more than I've earned, he said. I'll take it. Behind us, the War Council's voices rose in the great hall, Ronan's steady command cutting through the noise, and I felt, for the first time since walking out of Thornwood's rejection 7 years' worth of grief ago, that whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. Chapter 25. A Crown Not Given. The Circle of Ash arrived at dawn 2 days later, exactly as the scouts had predicted, a force of nearly 60 wolves, moving through the northern tree line with the cold, coordinated precision of an army that had been planning this assault for far longer than my own awakening. Frost had settled over the battlefield overnight, and our combined lines stood breathing clouds into the gray morning light, Thornwood gray and Ashgrave green and gold shoulder to shoulder for the first time in either pack's memory. At their head rode a woman I recognized instantly, impossibly, from my mother's memories in the temple's reflecting pool, older now, silver-haired, her eyes the flat, hungry gray of every hunter who had chased me through these woods. She sat her horse like a queen surveying territory she already considered won, utterly unbothered by the 2 full pack lines arrayed against her. Vesper, Elder Rasmus breathed beside me, hatred and old fear both clear in his voice. Leader of the circle. I hoped she died in the years since your mother. I don't die easily, Vesper called across the field separating our forces, her voice carrying with unnatural clarity. Neither, it seems, does inconvenient bloodlines. Celine's daughter. You have her exact face. You killed her, I said, stepping forward, past the combined lines of Ashgrave and Thornwood wolves, unafraid in a way that surprised even me. Behind me, I heard Ronan shift as if to follow, then stop himself, some instinct telling him this confrontation belonged to me alone. I offered her a choice she refused. Power like yours does not belong scattered across mortal generations, hidden in ordinary marriages, wasted on ordinary lives. Vesper's eyes swept over me, calculating. I am offering you the same choice I offered her, girl, out of respect for what you carry. Come with us willingly. Let the circle bind your power properly, as it was always meant to be used. Your packs live. Your allies live. We take only what should have been ours 300 years ago. Behind me, I heard Bianca's sharp intake of breath, the first sound she'd made since the circle's line came into view. Whatever grievances still sat unresolved between us, I understood in that moment that she, too, understood exactly what accepting Vesper's offer would cost, and exactly what refusing it would risk for every wolf standing on that field. And if I refuse? Then Celine's daughter dies the same way Celine did, Vesper said simply. Except this time, we won't need to hunt a hidden child for 11 more years afterward. We'll simply take the power from your corpse instead of your compliance. Behind me, I felt Ronan and Cade both go rigid with fury, felt the combined packs shift restlessly, ready for a command to attack that I hadn't yet given. The frost beneath my boots seemed to hold its breath along with every wolf on that field, waiting to see which way the next few seconds would break. I thought of my mother, hunted and exhausted, choosing exile over compliance. I thought of 7 years standing by doorways, small and overlooked, surviving on silence, because silence had once been the only power available to me. I thought of the temple and the reflecting pool, and the goddess's voice telling me I was ready to become what my mother had always hoped I would have the chance to be. I was done making myself small for anyone's convenience. I am not my mother's hidden power waiting to be claimed, I said, my voice carrying across the field with a resonance that had nothing to do with volume. I am Nyx's granddaughter, Luna of the Moon in my own right, and I did not survive 7 years of being underestimated just to hand myself over to the next people who think that makes me easy to take. Silver light rose off my skin in a wave that lit the entire battlefield, and behind me, I heard both alphas finally give the order neither had wanted to wait any longer to give. The two lines surged forward together, gray and green and gold merging into a single tide, and whatever separate history Thornwood and Ashgrave carried into that dawn, they crossed the frost-hardened ground as one pack entirely. Chapter 26. Bianca's Confession. The battle that followed was chaos, wolves and hunters colliding across the field in a violence I tried, as much as I could, to temper with the power now steady beneath my skin, silver light lashing out to injure rather than kill wherever precision allowed it. Snarls and shouted commands blurred together across the frozen field, the metallic scent of blood rising sharp against the cold morning air, and somewhere in the noise I could hear Ronan's voice, commanding and clear, holding the center line steady against the circle's push. In the middle of it, I felt a presence at my side I hadn't expected. Bianca, shifted into her wolf form, fighting fiercely alongside Thornwood's line, throwing herself between me and a circle hunter who'd broken through toward my position. She took a wound meant for me, a deep gash along her flank, and shifted back to human form gasping against a fallen tree, blood soaking through her torn dress, her face gone the color of old ash. Why, I asked, kneeling beside her, pressing a hand to the wound, my power instinctively reaching to slow the bleeding, my mind racing through every reason Bianca might have had for throwing herself into a hunter's path meant for me instead. Because I spent 7 years hating you for a marriage neither of us chose, Bianca gasped, and I am tired, Wren, of being the villain in a story where the actual villains are riding across that field on horseback. I'd rather die meaning something than live having only ever been cruel to someone who never deserved it. You're not dying, I said fiercely, pouring more of the silver light into the wound, watching it knit slowly closed beneath my hands. Not today. Not for this. She stared at me, stunned, as the wound sealed fully, leaving nothing but a thin silver scar where a killing gash had been moments before. I stole from Ronan's study, she said weakly. I threatened to expose you to the council. I have spent 7 years making your life smaller so mine could feel bigger by comparison. I know, I said. We'll talk about all of it properly when this is over. Right now, I need you alive to have that conversation with. She let out a shaky, disbelieving laugh despite the pain, as if my mercy confused her more than the wound itself. You should hate me, she said. I would, in your position. I did for a while, I admitted. It turns out hate takes more energy than I have left to spend today. Around us, the battle raged on, but for one suspended moment it felt very far away, just two women who had spent 7 years as rivals finally seeing each other clearly, in the worst possible circumstances, on a field neither of us had chosen to fight on. Something shifted in her face, not gratitude exactly, but a recognition that cracked 7 years of careful cruelty wide open. Cade never loved me the way he should have either, you know. I think some part of him always knew, even when neither of us understood why, that he was promised to someone else entirely. I spent 7 years resenting you for a truth that was never actually your fault. We can both stop paying for a debt neither of us created, I said. But first, help me get you somewhere safe, and then help me end this war. She nodded, and for the first time since the night of my rejection, I saw something in Bianca's face that looked less like a rival and more like an ally forged, unexpectedly, in the middle of a battlefield neither of us had chosen either. I helped her to her feet, her weight leaning into mine more than either of us would likely admit to later, and together we made our way toward the healer's tent at the field's edge, an odd, unlikely pair moving through the chaos of a war neither of us had started, but both of us were now determined to survive. Chapter 27. The Pack Turns. The tide of the battle shifted the moment the combined Thornwood and Ashgrave forces stopped fighting as two separate packs and started fighting as one line. A shift Ronan called out across the field the instant he saw hunters exploiting the seams between our territories. Tomas, fighting near the center, was among the first to hear the call and adjust, falling back a half-step to close a gap beside an Ashgrave wolf he'd never trained alongside before that morning. And within minutes the whole battlefield had reorganized itself around that single, unified line. I moved through the chaos with a clarity I hadn't known I possessed, silver light guiding my power toward exactly where it was needed, healing a fallen Ashgrave guard, driving back 3 hunters converging on an exposed flank, shielding Elder Rasmus when a circle wolf nearly caught him from behind. Every use of the power left me a little more hollowed out, a little further from the ground, but I kept moving because stopping meant someone else paid for it. Vesper found me in the field center, exactly as I suspected she would, unwilling to let a battle she was clearly losing end without a direct confrontation. Her calm was the most unsettling thing about her, a stillness carved from 3 centuries of patience that no single battlefield loss could easily shake. "You fight like your mother," she said, circling me, her human form deceptively calm despite the chaos around us. She also refused to simply hand over what we needed. It cost her everything. "It cost you everything too," I said, meeting her circling steps with my own, refusing to let her flank me. 11 years of hunting a hidden child, and here you are, still losing to the same bloodline. Not for much longer. She lunged, faster than I expected, and only the power singing beneath my skin let me twist aside in time, silver light flaring instinctively to block the worst of the blow. The impact still knocked me back a full step, my boots skidding through frost-slick grass, and I understood in that instant that Vesper had survived 300 years of this exact fight for good reason. We fought across that field for what felt like both seconds and hours, her hunter's precision against my raw, still new divine strength, until finally, with Ronan's help closing in from one side and Cade's from the other, Vesper found herself surrounded. Her remaining hunters scattered or fallen, her army's advantage entirely gone. "Surrender," Ronan commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority across the field, every trace of the gentle man from the stone circle replaced by something forged entirely of command. "Or die here, exactly where your hunt finally ends." Vesper's eyes moved between the 3 of us, the Alpha King, the Thornwood Alpha, and the last daughter of the moon standing united against her for the first time in 300 years of the circle's hunting. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "The circle does not simply end because one battle is lost." "No," I agreed. "But it ends here, today, as a threat to me specifically. Whatever remains of your circle after this, you will hunt somewhere else, or you will not hunt at all. That is the only mercy I'm offering." She fled rather than surrender fully, taking what remained of her scattered forces with her, and the field slowly quieted, the combined packs of Thornwood and Ashgrave standing together over a battlefield that, against every old rivalry between them, they had just won as allies rather than enemies. Wounded wolves helped each other to their feet regardless of which colors they wore, a small, quiet miracle none of us had thought to expect from a morning that began in cold, frost-covered dread. Chapter 28. Cade's reckoning begins. In the aftermath, As the wounded were tended and the dead were honored, Cade found me at the edge of the battlefield, exhausted, my divine power finally quiet beneath my skin after hours of use. Healers moved between the fallen with practiced urgency, and somewhere behind us a young ash-grave wolf wept openly over a pack mate who hadn't survived the morning, a sound that settled heavy over the whole field despite the victory. "You saved my pack today," he said quietly, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something rawer underneath it. "Bianca, Rasmus. A dozen wolves who would have died without your power holding the line." "I saved everyone I could reach," I said. "That includes your pack. It also includes Ronan's." I wasn't choosing sides today, Cade. I was choosing to survive and to protect the people who chose to fight alongside me. My voice carried more exhaustion than conviction by that point, the day's power finally catching up with my body in a wave of bone-deep fatigue. "I know." He looked out over the field, silent for a long moment. "I've spent this entire day watching you become someone I don't think I ever truly knew, even in the years we were technically married. And I understand, watching it, exactly how much smaller I made your life by never once giving you the chance to become her sooner." I let the silence stretch between us, unwilling to offer comfort I didn't yet feel, though something in his honesty, finally, after everything, softened the edge of the anger I'd carried since the Great Hall. "You can't undo 7 years, Cade." "No," he agreed, his gaze dropping briefly to the frost-hardened ground between us before finding mine again with what looked like genuine resolve rather than mere performance. "But I can stop adding to them. Whatever you decide about us, about the marriage, about the mark I never gave you, I want you to know I release you from the debt contract entirely, formally, tonight, in front of witnesses. Not because the circle forced my hand today, but because I should have done it the moment I understood what it had actually cost you." Something in his voice, finally, sounded like the version of him I'd glimpsed at our wedding 7 years ago, before fear and his father's silence had buried it beneath 7 years of careful distance. I didn't answer right away, watching the healers work at the field's edge, letting the moment sit unresolved between us rather than rushing to fill it with either forgiveness or further anger. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "Ronan loves you," Cade said, not quite a question, watching my face for a reaction I didn't fully hide. I could see it today, the way he fought, the way he watched you across that field. "I don't think it's a passing fascination, Wren. I think it's the real thing, the thing our marriage was never actually built to become." "I know," I said quietly. "Do you love him back?" I thought about the stairwell in Thornwood's hall, recognition passing between two strangers who had never met. I thought about the stone circle, his hands framing my face after the hunter attack, the fear in his voice that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with genuinely, terrifyingly caring whether I lived or died. I thought about 7 years of being unseen, and how completely different it felt to finally be seen by someone who had never once needed convincing. "I think I do," I said. "I think I have for longer than 4 weeks should reasonably allow, but nothing about the last month has been reasonable, so I've stopped expecting it to be." Cade nodded, something like peace settling into his exhausted expression. "Then let him be the one, Wren. Truly. I release you from every claim I never should have made in the first place." Chapter 29. Ronan's Offer. Ronan found me an hour later, in the quiet after the battlefield had finally emptied of everything but grief and exhausted relief, and he didn't say anything at first, just crossed the distance between us and pulled me into an embrace that held 7 years of loneliness at bay more completely than any words could have managed. His coat still carried the cold of the open field, and beneath it I could feel his heartbeat, faster than it should have been for a man simply standing still, evidence of exactly how much the day had cost him too. "I thought I might lose you today," he said into my hair. "More than once. Watching you fight Vesper alone in the middle of that field, I have never in my life felt fear like that." "I wasn't alone," I said. "You were there. Cade was there. Bianca, Rasmus, both our packs together. I've spent 7 years believing I had no one. Today I learned exactly how wrong that was." He pulled back just enough to look at me properly, mud and dried blood still streaked across his jaw, and something in his expression made it clear the day had rearranged something fundamental in him too, not just in me. He pulled back enough to look at me properly, his hands framing my face the way they had that first night after the hunter attack, and this time, neither of us hesitated before closing the remaining distance between us. The kiss felt like everything the temple's silver light had promised without words: recognition, homecoming, a future finally choosing itself instead of being assigned by contracts and debts neither of us had asked for. Somewhere below the terrace, the estate's exhausted celebration carried faintly upward, laughter and low music, and neither of us moved to rejoin it for a long, unhurried while. "Cade released you," Ronan said quietly, when we finally broke apart. "Formally tonight. Rasmus told me before I came to find you." "He did." "I know this is fast," Ronan said, his voice careful, deliberate, one hand still resting lightly at my waist, as if he needed the contact to steady his own next words. "I know we've known each other barely a month, and most of that month has been treaty negotiations and battlefield chaos, rather than anything resembling courtship. But I am not interested in waiting 7 more years to tell you plainly what I already know to be true, Wren. I love you. I loved you from the stairwell, before I understood why, and every day since has only made that truth more certain, not less. I love you too," I said, and felt the words settle into place with a certainty 7 years of careful silence had never once allowed me to feel about anything. My whole chest loosening around a truth I hadn't fully let myself name until the moment it left my mouth. I don't need 7 years of courtship to know that. I've spent 7 years learning exactly what it feels like to be with someone who doesn't, and this is not that. "Then marry me," Ronan said, quiet and sure. "Properly. Publicly. Marked, claimed, and crowned as Ashgrave's Luna, chosen freely by both of us, with nothing hidden and no debt standing between the choice." I laughed, half in disbelief, half in something closer to joy than I'd felt in longer than I could remember. A month ago, I was pouring tea for a woman who'd taken my title, standing by a kitchen door in an apron. Now an alpha king is asking me to marry him in his own garden under a full moon. "Does that frighten you?" he asked, searching my face carefully. "No," I said. "It feels like the first thing in my entire life that's actually made sense." "Yes," I said, and meant it more completely than I had ever meant anything in my life. He kissed me again, slower this time, and somewhere in that kiss I felt the last of 7 years' worth of careful, guarded distance finally dissolve completely. I thought, absurdly, of the gray dress I used to wear specifically to disappear into Thornwood's wallpaper, and understood that I would never again need a dress built for disappearing. Whatever I wore from this point forward, I intended to be seen fully in it, exactly as Ronan had already chosen to see me since the moment his eyes first found mine in a dark stairwell 3 floors above where he stood. "There is a great deal to arrange," he said eventually, pulling back just far enough to rest his forehead against mine. "A formal proposal to the Elders' Council. Preparations across both territories. Cade's release of the marriage contract, made public rather than whispered. None of it will be simple." "Nothing about the last month has been simple," I said. "I don't see why the rest of it should start now." Chapter 30. The goddess speaks my name. Word of the battle, and of the coming marriage, spread through both territories within days, but it was the ceremony itself, small, urgent, held at Ashgrave's Great Hall barely a week after the Circle's defeat, where the last piece of my transformation finally settled into place. Ashgrave's staff had worked through the nights leading up to it, hanging fresh green and gold banners beside borrowed Thornwood gray, and I remember thinking, standing in the doorway before it began, how strange it was to feel this steady on a day that carried this much weight. Elder Rasmus presided, at my request, his old voice steady despite the tears he no longer bothered hiding, his hands, when he took mine to begin the ceremony, warm and familiar in a way that reminded me, achingly, of every kindness he'd offered my family across 2 generations. Cade stood as witness, his presence a quiet, deliberate act of grace neither of us had expected from him 7 years ago. Bianca stood beside him, healed, humbled, genuinely present in a way that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of an actual friendship rather than a rivalry finally exhausted. I felt his pulse quicken beneath my palm as he drew me close and understood, in that small physical detail, exactly how much this moment meant to a man who rarely let anything show past his careful composure. Ronan marked me at the ceremony's height, his claiming bite given freely, witnessed, binding, everything Cade's fear had denied me for 7 years, given now without hesitation, without secrecy, without a single doubt standing between us. The hall held its breath as he did it, 200 wolves from 2 different packs watching in a silence that felt nothing at all like the silence that had once followed my rejection. This silence held reverence rather than judgment, anticipation rather than dismissal, and I let myself feel every ounce of the difference. The moment his mark settled into my skin, the silver light beneath it flared brighter than it ever had before, and the temple's reflecting pool, though miles away, sent a pulse of warmth through my entire body that I recognized instantly. Now, the goddess's voice said, filling not just my mind but, for the first time, the entire hall, audible to every wolf present, you are fully claimed, fully marked, fully awake. Rise, Wren, daughter of my daughter, Luna of Ashgrave, and hear the name your bloodline has been waiting 300 years to finally speak aloud. Silver light filled the hall, and in it, for one breathtaking moment, every wolf present saw the goddess herself, radiant and vast, her hand resting on my shoulder like a blessing given freely after 3 centuries of hiding. Gasps rippled through the crowd, more than one hardened warrior dropping to their knees unbidden, overtaking whatever composure the formal ceremony had asked of them. The name moved through me like the tide finding its proper shore, ancient and inevitable and entirely, finally mine. Wren Calloway, the goddess said, and the name settled into the room like a coronation in itself. Daughter of Selene, granddaughter of the moon, Luna of Ashgrave by mark and by choice. The circle of ash will not stop hunting what you carry, but you will never again face them hidden, alone, or unmarked. That chapter of your story has finally, fully ended. The hall erupted in a sound I had never once heard directed at me in 7 years at Thornwood, genuine, joyful celebration. 2 packs no longer divided by treaty lines, but united around a Luna who had earned, through fire and grief and hard-won courage, every bit of the crown now settling, invisible but unmistakable, over her silver-marked brow. I found Cade's eyes across the celebrating crowd, and he raised his glass to me, a small, private acknowledgement between 2 people who had shared 7 complicated years and were only now, finally, learning how to let each other go with something resembling grace. Bianca stood beside him, smiling in a way I hadn't seen from her before that evening, unguarded and genuinely glad, and I understood that whatever came next for the 3 of us, it would be built on far steadier ground than anything the last 7 years had offered. I looked across the hall at Ronan, at Cade, at Bianca, at Elder Erasmus, at every wolf who had once overlooked me and now could not look away, and felt, for the first time in my entire life, that I was exactly, fully, unmistakably home. Chapter 31. The King Who Kneels First. The Elders' Council of the Greater Wolf Territories convened within the week, summoned by the scale of the battle and the impossible fact of a living daughter of the moon standing in front of them, silver-eyed and marked, demanding to be heard. 11 elders arrived from territories I had never heard named in 7 years at Thornwood, each bringing their own guards, their own suspicions, and their own centuries-old opinions about what my bloodline meant for the balance of power across the entire region. Ronan stood beside me as Ashgrave's alpha, presenting our marriage and my claim before 11 elders drawn from packs across the region, men and women who had spent their whole lives believing the old stories about divine bloodlines were exactly that, stories. This body must formally recognize what already stands before you, Ronan said, his voice carrying easily through the council hall, steady in a way that left no doubt he'd rehearsed this argument through most of the sleepless night before. Wren Calloway has ended a 300-year hunt that has cost this region countless lives across countless generations. She did it as an outsider, unmarked and unprotected, with 2 packs worth of politics working against her. I would ask this council what more proof of a rightful claim any of you require. The eldest council member, a stern woman named Elder Voss, no relation to Bianca, though the name made me flinch regardless, studied me for a long moment. The old stories say a true daughter of the moon kneels to no alpha, no king, no council. That she is, in her own right, sovereign. I felt Ronan's hand find mine briefly beneath the table, a small, steadying gesture that gave me the last measure of courage the moment required. I have no interest in sovereignty over anyone who hasn't asked for it, I said. I have interest in a region no longer hunted by the Circle of Ash, and in pacts that stop trading daughters like debts to be settled. If recognizing my claim helps secure that, then recognize it. If not, I will protect this region regardless, with or without this council's blessing. A murmur rippled through the assembled elders, some clearly startled by the bluntness of it, others nodding slowly, as if the answer had told them more about my character than any formal proof of bloodline could have. Something shifted in Elder Voss's expression, not quite a smile, but close to respect. Bold words for someone who spent 7 years, by all accounts, standing quietly by doorways. I had 7 years of practice being underestimated, I said. I don't intend to waste the education. To my genuine surprise, it was Ronan who knelt first, not out of council protocol, which required no such gesture from an Alpha King, but simply, deliberately, in front of the entire assembled council. His head bowed toward me with unmistakable intention. I kneel freely, he said, to the woman I love, and to the Luna this region owes a debt it can never fully repay. Let the council do with that gesture what it will. I have no regrets offering it. A ripple of murmurs moved through the assembled elders, some scandalized, others visibly moved, and I stood at the center of it all feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in that formal, unfamiliar hall, entirely, unshakably certain of exactly who I had chosen to become. One by one, gradually, uncertainly, other alphas in attendance followed, Cade among the first, his own knee bending with a solemnity that spoke of genuine remorse rather than performance. Elder Rasmus knelt without hesitation, tears once again threatening his composure. And slowly, reluctantly, the council itself rose from their seats to offer the same gesture, formal recognition finally, unmistakably given. Only Elder Voss remained seated a moment longer than the rest, her sharp eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't yet read, not hostility exactly, but something measuring, unresolved, as if her verdict on what I truly was had not yet finished forming. Chapter 32. Cade's groveling. The council's business concluded, but Cade requested a private audience before I left the hall, his expression carrying a weight I recognized as something he'd been building toward for days. He had asked Elder Rasmus twice already, I later learned, whether the timing was right, whether he'd earned the standing to say what he intended to say in front of witnesses at all. I need to say something in front of witnesses, he said, gesturing to Elder Rasmus, Ronan, and Bianca, who had all remained nearby. Not privately, where it's easy to say and easier to forget. Publicly, where it costs something to say and matters that I mean it. Cade, you don't have to. I do, he said, cutting me off gently. Please. Let me finish this properly. He knelt again, this time not before the council, but before me directly, his head bowed in a posture I had genuinely never seen him take in 7 years of marriage. The hall around us had gone utterly silent, every witness sensing that whatever came next mattered more than the formal council business that had preceded it. I married you as a debt, he said, voice rough, unable to fully meet my eyes even now. I let my father's fear and my own cowardice keep you unmarked, unprotected, and unseen for 7 years. I let Bianca humiliate you in my own house while I told myself silence was easier than confrontation. I let you believe, every single day of those 7 years, that you were unworthy of the mark I was too afraid to give you. None of that was ever your failing, Wren. It was entirely mine, and I am ashamed of every year it took me to understand that. His voice cracked, and for a moment, the alpha, the husband, the man who had once stood in front of 200 wolves and publicly rejected me, looked entirely undone. I don't ask for your forgiveness because I've earned it, he continued. I haven't. I ask only that you know I see now, fully, everything I cost you, and that I will spend whatever years I have left trying to be the kind of alpha and the kind of man who never lets fear become an excuse for cruelty again. The hall held its breath around us, 200 witnesses watching a reckoning that belonged, in the end, to only 2 people, and I found myself grateful oddly that he'd insisted on saying it here rather than in some private corner where it would have been easier for both of us to pretend it hadn't cost anything. Somewhere behind me, I heard Elder Rasmus's breath catch, and I understood, without turning to look, that he was thinking of my mother, of every year of silence that had preceded this one, imperfect, overdue reckoning. The hall had gone completely silent, every witness holding their breath. I knelt down in front of him, meeting him at eye level, the way I'd wished, 7 years ago, someone might have met me. "I don't forgive you because you've earned it either," I said. "I forgive you because carrying that anger for the rest of my life costs me more than it costs you, and I refuse to let 7 years of your cowardice take one more thing from me. Rise, Cade. Be better. That's the only apology I actually need from you." He rose, and something in his posture looked lighter than I'd seen it in years. Not absolved, but finally, genuinely, moving forward instead of hiding. "Bianca," I said, turning to her. "You saved my life on that battlefield. That matters more to me than anything that happened before it. I release you from whatever guilt you're still carrying too." Bianca's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. "I don't know how to be anything other than who I was for 7 years, she admitted. "But I would like the chance to learn if Thornwood will still have me." "Thornwood will," Cade said immediately. "As my sister in arms, if nothing else. You fought for this pack when it mattered most. That earns you a place here, Bianca, whatever else needs mending between us." Bianca wiped her eyes and nodded, and I caught, just for a moment, Elder Voss watching the whole exchange from the edge of the hall with that same unreadable, measuring expression, as if Thornwood's reckoning were only the opening argument in a larger judgment still to come. Chapter 33. The Pact Demands Answers. Word of the debt contract and Cade's father's secret agreement with the Circle of Ash spread through Thornwood territory within days, and the Pact's reaction was exactly the reckoning Cade had been bracing for. Whispered conversations fell silent whenever he passed in the hallways, and more than one elder wolf who had served his father for decades now regarded him with open, uncomfortable scrutiny. I returned to Thornwood briefly, at Cade's request, to stand beside him as he addressed his own people directly, not as their alpha issuing a decree, but as a man finally accountable for 7 years of decisions made in their name without their knowledge. "My father sold Wren's safety to buy this pack a generation of peace," Cade told the assembled pack, standing in the same great hall where he had once publicly rejected me. "I knew and said nothing for 7 years. I let an innocent woman live under this roof, unmarked and unprotected, while I protected a secret that should have died with the agreement itself." The pack's reaction was immediate and furious, not directed at me, to my genuine surprise, but at the legacy of leadership that had used a grieving child as currency without her knowledge or consent. Voices rose over each other across the hall, old grievances about Cade's father's rule surfacing alongside this new one, until Cade raised a hand for quiet and, remarkably, got it. "Why should we trust anything this pack does going forward?" one voice called out, "if this is the kind of decision our leadership has been making in the dark." A chorus of agreement followed, older wolves and younger ones alike, a rare unity of grievance across generational lines I hadn't seen in this hall in all my years living beneath its roof. He stood taller than I'd seen him stand in years, some old, buried confidence finally resurfacing now that honesty rather than concealment had become his strategy. "You shouldn't trust it blindly," Cade said, raising his voice enough to carry over the murmuring crowd. "You should demand transparency going forward, exactly as you're doing right now. I am formally proposing a council of pack representatives, elected rather than appointed, to review any future agreement of this significance before it's finalized. I should have had that oversight 7 years ago. I am building it now because Wren, and every wolf in this pack, deserves better than decisions made in secret by an alpha who mistook silence for strength." The proposal, radical by Thornwood's traditional standards, was met with cautious but genuine approval, the first real structural change the pack had seen in generations, born directly out of the reckoning my presence had forced into the open. Later that evening, before the messenger's news pulled my attention toward Bianca's judgment, I walked the familiar halls of Thornwood one final time as something other than a stranger passing through. I found the kitchen exactly as I'd left it, the ovens cold, the good china still displayed on its shelf, and stood there for a long moment simply remembering the version of myself who had spent 7 years finding whatever small piece she could in that one room. I did not regret those years entirely. They had taught me patience, confidence, the particular strength of a woman who survives quietly rather than loudly. But I was glad, standing there now, that I would never again need those specific lessons the same way. What happens to you now? Tomas, the patrol leader who had released the Ashgrave wolf at my insistence weeks before, asked me directly, his voice carrying real curiosity rather than suspicion. Are you still connected to Thornwood at all, my Luna, or Alpha King Ashgraves now entirely? I am Ashgrave's Luna, by mark and by choice, I said. But Thornwood is where I grew up, where Elder Rasmus kept my mother's memory alive when everyone else let it fade, where I learned, however painfully, exactly how much I could survive. I don't intend to disappear from this pack story, Tomas. I intend to help it become something better than what nearly cost me my life to escape. Tomas nodded, satisfied, but as he turned to go, a messenger arrived at a dead run from the estate gates, breathless, carrying word that would pull my attention entirely away from Thornwood's new council. Elder Voss had summoned the full council early, and Bianca's judgment was to be decided that very afternoon. Chapter 34. Bianca's Fall. The Elders' Council, having recognized my claim, turned its attention next to the matter of Bianca's actions, the theft from Ronan's study, the threats made against me, actions that under strict pack law carried serious consequences. I arrived at the hall still travel-dusty from Thornwood, Cade close behind me, both of us uncertain what Elder Voss's sudden urgency actually meant for the woman waiting, alone and pale, at the center of the room. Bianca stood before the council alone, having refused both Cade's and my offers to speak on her behalf, insisting on facing the judgment honestly rather than hiding behind others' protection. She wore no finery for the occasion, only a plain gray dress, as if she'd chosen deliberately to stand before the elders looking like exactly what she'd once mocked me for being. I stole treaty documents from Alpha King Ashgrave's private study, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the admission, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the only visible sign of how much the confession cost her. I threatened to expose Wren's bloodline to this very council out of fear for my own position. I spent 7 years treating an innocent woman with a cruelty she never once deserved. I offer no excuse for any of it, only the truth of what I did and why. Elder Voss studied her for a long moment, the hall so quiet I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth behind the council's bench. The council could strip you of pack standing entirely for theft against a sovereign alpha's household. Some among us would argue for far worse. I understand, Bianca said. I accept whatever judgment this council deems appropriate. She didn't look toward Cade or me for support, standing entirely on her own, and something about that solitary composure made the whole hall go a little quieter with respect it hadn't expected to offer her. I stepped forward before the council could deliberate further. I would ask this council to consider one additional fact before ruling, I said. Bianca Voss took a hunter's blade meant for me on the battlefield against the Circle of Ash. She nearly died protecting the same woman she once threatened to expose. I do not believe people are only the worst thing they've done, particularly when they've since risked everything to become something better. The council deliberated privately for the better part of an hour while Bianca waited, pale but composed, in the hall outside. When they returned, Elder Voss's verdict carried a gravity that silenced the room. In light of the Luna Wren Nixera's testimony and the documented actions on the battlefield, this council finds Bianca Voss's debt to be paid through service rendered, rather than punishment demanded. She retains her standing within Thornwood Pack, on the condition that she serve a term assisting the new Representative Council Alpha, Cade, has proposed, accountability, rather than exile, as this council's answer to genuine remorse. Bianca's composure finally broke, tears spilling freely as she turned to me. You didn't have to do that. No, I agreed. I chose to, because I remember exactly what it felt like to have my worst circumstances define me before anyone bothered asking who I actually was underneath them. You deserve the same chance to be more than 7 years of cruelty, Bianca. I hope you take it. Elder Voss watched the whole exchange with the same unreadable expression she'd worn since the recognition ceremony, and as the hall began to empty, she caught my arm briefly at the door. You show mercy easily, Luna Nixera, she said, quiet enough for only me to hear. I wonder if you'll show it as easily when it's my judgment of you, rather than Bianca Voss's, that this council is weighing. I turned to face her fully, unwilling to let the comment pass unanswered. Is there a judgment pending, Elder Voss? I was under the impression this council had already recognized my claim. Recognition is easily given in the glow of a battlefield victory, she said, unmoved. The old stories tell of daughters of the moon who used their power wisely for decades before eventually succumbing to the same temptations that corrupted the circle they once opposed. I have sat on this council for 60 years, child. I have watched good intentions curdle before. I intend to watch you closely, not because I doubt your victory today, but because I have learned not to mistake a single victory for a settled character. It was, I understood even as it stung, a fair position for a woman in her role to hold, and I found myself, despite the discomfort of the exchange, respecting her for refusing to simply follow the room's enthusiasm. Chapter 35. Choosing myself. In the quiet weeks that followed the council's rulings, as both packs settled into an uneasy but genuine peace, I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, facing a question no one else could answer for me. What did I actually want? Now that debt contracts and rejection and hunted bloodlines no longer dictated every choice available to me? Elder Voss's parting words at the council hall door had stayed with me through every one of those quiet weeks, a small, persistent unease I hadn't yet found the courage to address directly. I walked the grounds of Ashgrave's estate alone one evening, turning the question over, my new crown consort duties already piling in neat, unfamiliar stacks on a desk I hadn't fully claimed as mine yet, and found the goddess's voice waiting for me at the edge of the tree line, gentler now, less urgent than it had ever been. Her presence settled over the clearing like warm mist, familiar now in a way it hadn't been even a month before. You have spent your whole life being chosen for, she said. Married for a debt. Rejected for a rival's ambition. Hunted for a bloodline you never asked to carry. Even now, claimed and marked and crowned, tell me honestly, granddaughter, is any of it something you actually chose, or has it simply been the least cruel option available in each moment? The question landed harder than I expected. I chose Ronan, I said slowly. That much, at least, was entirely mine. Yes. And what else, beyond him, do you choose for yourself, now that choosing is finally, fully possible? I thought about it seriously, for the first time, sitting on a stone bench at the edge of the tree line while the evening cooled around me. I thought about the years I'd spent invisible in Thornwood's kitchen, capable and unseen, running a household with a competence no one had ever acknowledged. I thought about the treaty negotiations at Ashgrave, the quiet satisfaction of untangling a decade of border theft with nothing but memory and careful attention. I thought about Bianca's fall and rise, about Thornwood's new representative council, about an entire region still recovering from 300 years of a hunt that had only just ended. I want to help build something, I said slowly, the answer arriving with a clarity that surprised me. Not just be a Luna who stands beside an Alpha King. I want a role of my own, bridging Thornwood and Ashgrave, maybe eventually the wider council. Someone who makes sure no other bloodline gets hidden or hunted or married off as debt payment ever again. That, the goddess said, warmth filling her voice, sounds considerably more like a woman choosing her own crown than one simply accepting whatever crown was offered to her. I sat with that thought long after her presence faded from the clearing, watching moonlight shift slowly across the grass, feeling for the first time in my life the strange, quiet satisfaction of wanting something entirely because I wanted it, rather than because it was the safest or smallest option available to me. I found Ronan later that evening and told him what I wanted, bracing, some old instinct still whispering that my ambitions might be too much, might need his permission first. I told him, too, about Elder Voss's warning and watched his expression sharpen into the same careful calculation he wore before any difficult negotiation. "Wren," he said, laughing softly, pulling me close. "You ended a 300-year war and reformed Thornwood's entire governance structure in the space of a month. I would be a fool to think I get any say in what you build next. I intend only to stand beside you while you build it." "And Elder Voss?" I asked, unable to fully shake the unease. His humor faded, replaced by something more careful. "Elder Voss has outlived 4 Alpha Kings and buried opinions on all of them. If she's watching you closely, it's because she takes your claims seriously enough to test it properly, not because she intends to deny it. But we should prepare for that test regardless, whatever shape it takes." Chapter 36. The Ashgrave Throne. Preparations began for a formal coronation, not the small, urgent ceremony where Ronan had first marked me, but a full public event, uniting both packs and inviting elders from across the region to witness Ashgrave's new Luna claim her place fully. Publicly, permanently. Bianca, of all people, took charge of the guest arrangements, applying the same exacting standards she'd once used to make my life miserable toward making the coronation flawless instead. I found her one afternoon in the middle of a heated debate with the head steward about seating precedence between visiting elders and realized, watching her work, that her particular gifts had never actually been cruelty itself, only the misdirection of a genuine talent for command that Thornwood had never once given her a productive outlet for. Cade noticed it too. I caught him watching her across the planning table more than once with an expression that looked less like old resentment and more like something new beginning, slowly, to take root. Elder Rasmus, meanwhile, spent his days telling anyone who would listen about my mother, filling in decades of details I'd never had access to, her favorite flowers, the particular way she used to laugh, the small kindnesses she'd shown him during his own difficult years as a young elder still finding his footing. I found myself seeking him out each evening just to hear one more story, greedy for every fragment of a woman I was only now, finally, getting to know. Elder Voss herself sent formal confirmation that she would attend and preside over the recognition portion of the ceremony personally, a message that read, on its surface, as an honor, and beneath it, unmistakably, as a warning that her test was still coming. The throne room itself, long unused for anything beyond ceremonial treaty signings, was transformed for the occasion, banners of green and gold alongside Thornwood's gray and black. The first time the two packs' colors had ever hung side by side in celebration rather than negotiation. Servants strung moon-silver ribbon along every archway, and someone, I never learned who, had planted late-blooming white flowers along the terrace steps that only opened fully after dark. 3 days before the coronation, a messenger arrived from Ashgrave's northern patrol with news that stopped every preparation in the estate cold. Vesper had regrouped what remained of the Circle of Ash and was moving south with a smaller, but more desperate force, apparently determined to disrupt the coronation itself rather than accept the Circle's defeat as final. "She's out of options," Ronan said grimly, studying the patrol reports in the war room that had briefly, hopefully, gone quiet since the last battle, one hand braced flat against the map table as if the weight of it helped him think. "The Circle's numbers are cut in half. Word of the Elders' Council recognition has spread through every allied territory. This is a last, desperate strike, not a real campaign. Desperate people are often the most dangerous," Elder Rasmus warned, his old hands folded atop his cane, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had survived more than one desperate enemy in his long life. "Especially when they have nothing left to lose." I felt the divine power beneath my skin respond to the threat with a steadiness that surprised me, not the frightened uncertainty of my first encounter with Vesper's hunters, but something calmer, more assured. The confidence of someone who had already survived this exact enemy once before. "Let her come," I said. "If Vesper wants to disrupt a coronation, She'll find every wolf in this region standing united against her, rather than divided by treaty lines she could have exploited a month ago. Whatever she brings, we're stronger for it than she is. You want to proceed with the ceremony as planned? Ronan asked, searching my face for hesitation he didn't find, though I could see him bracing for it anyway, some old protective instinct unwilling to fully believe I'd stay the course until I actually confirmed it aloud. I want to be crowned in front of the exact threat that spent 300 years insisting women like me should stay hidden, I said. There's no message I could send that would matter more than that. The preparations continued, guards doubled along every border, both packs' warriors quietly positioned throughout the estate grounds, and 3 days later, as the sun set golden and crimson over Ashgrave's mountains, the coronation began exactly as planned. Vesper's coming assault the only shadow over an otherwise unstoppable celebration. Chapter 37. War at the Border. Vesper's forces struck at the ceremony's midpoint, exactly as our scouts had warned, a smaller, but still dangerous force breaking through Ashgrave's northern patrol line in a desperate bid to reach the throne room before the coronation could be completed. The first sign was a horn blast from the outer wall, sharp and urgent enough to cut clean through the music and laughter filling the hall, and I watched Ronan's expression shift instantly from celebration to command. They didn't get far. Ronan's guards, doubled and waiting, met them at the estate's outer walls, and within minutes the assault had collapsed into the same losing chaos the Circle had faced weeks before, their numbers too depleted, their advantage of surprise entirely gone. Inside the hall, most of the guests never even registered the disturbance beyond a brief flurry of guards slipping out a side door and back in again. Vesper herself broke through the outer defense alone, driven by something past strategy now, pure desperate fury carrying her through wolves twice her strength toward the throne room where the ceremony continued, undisturbed, protected by an inner ring of guards who had anticipated exactly this possibility. I felt her coming before I saw her, a cold, familiar pressure against the edge of my awareness that the silver light beneath my skin recognized instantly as danger. She made it as far as the throne room's threshold before I met her myself, stepping away from the dais mid-ceremony, silver light already rising to meet the threat before she'd taken 3 steps into the hall. Guests scattered back against the walls, and I heard Ronan's low, urgent command for the room to be cleared, though no one moved fast enough to miss what happened next. You could have simply let this end, I said, power steady and controlled beneath my skin, nothing like the frightened woman who had faced her hunters alone in the forest weeks before. It doesn't end while you're still breathing, Vesper snarled, lunging with the last of whatever strength she had left. I didn't need Ronan's help this time. The silver light met her attack and held it, contained it, and for the first time since the temple's awakening, I understood fully the difference between power still learning its own edges and power that had finally, completely settled into place. Yield, I said, or this ends here, permanently, exactly the way you wanted it to end for my mother. My voice didn't shake. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I meant every word of it completely. For a long moment, Vesper simply stared at me, hatred and exhaustion both plain on her face, and then, finally, something in her posture broke. The circle is finished, she said, bitterness thick in her voice. You've made certain of that. There's nothing left for me to fight for, except the fight itself. There was something almost pitiable in the admission, a woman who had spent 3 centuries defining herself entirely by a hunt now facing the prospect of an identity with nothing left to chase. Then stop fighting, I said, quieter now, some old mercy rising in me despite everything she'd cost my family. 300 years of hunting my bloodline has cost the Circle everything it was built to gain. Let it end, Vesper. Not with your death. With your surrender, and whatever peace remains possible after that. She was taken into custody rather than killed, the Circle's remaining forces scattered and disarmed, and as the guards led her away, she looked back at me once, an expression I couldn't fully read crossing her face, not quite gratitude, but something close to the exhausted relief of a war finally, truly over. Ronan found me moments later, checking me over with the same urgent thoroughness he'd shown after the first hunter attack in the stone circle. You could have killed her, he said, not quite a question. Everyone would have understood if you had. I know, I said. I almost did. But my mother didn't die so that I could become someone who ends every threat with a killing blow when mercy is still an option. I don't want that to be the first thing this crown teaches people to expect from me. He studied me for a long moment, something like pride settling into his exhausted expression, and pulled me close without another word, the guests behind us slowly filing back into the throne room to finish what Vesper's assault had interrupted. Chapter 38. The Last Rejection. With Vesper's assault contained, the ceremony resumed, though the interruption had cost us the golden hour of sunset the coronation had originally been timed around. Servants relit the hall's torches against the gathering dusk, and the guests, shaken but resettled, took their places once more with a new, charged attentiveness that hadn't been in the room before the horn sounded. I stood once more before the assembled elders, both Pax and Ronan, ready to complete what the Circle's desperate attack had briefly delayed. It was Elder Voss, unexpectedly, who raised her hand before the ceremony could continue, silencing the hall with the gravity of her position, and I felt Ronan's hand tighten briefly around mine. The same wary attentiveness from our earlier conversation about her returning to his face. The rest of the elders exchanged glances, clearly as uncertain as we were about what she intended to say. She rose slowly to her feet, every eye in the hall following the deliberate weight of the motion, and for a moment I braced myself for the same measuring scrutiny she'd shown me since the recognition ceremony weeks before. Whatever test she'd promised at the council hall door had clearly waited for exactly this moment, in front of every witness who mattered, to finally arrive. Before this council formally seats a new Luna with standing across both territories, she said, I would ask one final question, not as an obstacle, but as the last true test the old stories demand of any claimant to a moon-blessed crown. Her eyes found mine, steady and searching. The old stories say true daughters of the moon must, at the moment of their coronation, choose their crown freely, one final time, with full knowledge of everything it will cost them. Wren Calloway, knowing that this crown means continued danger from whatever remains of the Circle, knowing it means a life of responsibility to 2 packs and likely more before your work is finished, knowing it means never again the option of disappearing quietly into an ordinary, overlooked life, do you still choose it? The question landed with a weight I felt in my very bones, silencing even the restless murmur that had followed the earlier assault, and I understood, standing there, that this was its own kind of rejection being offered. The last chance to walk away from a life demanding everything of me, the last door out before it closed permanently. I thought of 7 years standing by doorways, small and unseen, and of every moment since walking out of Thornwood's Hall in the rain that had asked me to become larger than that fear allowed. I thought of the mud on my shoes that first night, the rain soaking through an apron I hadn't thought to remove, and understood that every step between that night and this one had been leading, inevitably, toward this exact question. I thought of my mother, choosing an ordinary, hidden life out of love and exhaustion both, and understood, finally, that I was not required to make the same choice she had, that the danger she'd hidden me from could now be faced rather than fled. I choose it, I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall with absolute certainty. Not because it's safe. Not because it's easy. Because for the first time in my entire life, this is a life I am choosing for myself, built by my own hands, standing beside people who chose me back freely, rather than a life assigned to me by debt or fear or anyone else's decision. I reject nothing about what this crown will cost me. I have spent 7 years being rejected by people too afraid to choose me. I will not now reject myself out of the same fear. Elder Voss's expression, for the first time since I'd met her, broke into something close to a genuine smile. Then let this council, and both territories, finally, fully welcome their Luna. She inclined her head toward me, a gesture of respect I understood now had been hard-won rather than freely given, and something in the formality of it meant more to me than the earlier, easier applause of the crowd. For what it's worth, she added, quiet enough that only those nearest us could hear, I did not expect to like the answer as much as I did. For what it's worth, I said, I didn't expect to be grateful for the question. Every crown should have to answer it honestly at least once. Chapter 39. Vows that hold. The formal vows came next, spoken not in the rushed urgency of our first marking, but slowly, deliberately, in front of every witness who mattered, Cade and Bianca standing together as Thornwood's representatives, Elder Rasmus presiding over the sacred portion of the ceremony, the assembled elders bearing witness to a union built, finally, on choice rather than obligation. Elder Voss stood near the front of the assembly, arms folded, her earlier test apparently satisfied by everything she had witnessed on that battlefield, though she offered no explanation beyond a single, approving nod in my direction as the vows began. Elder Rasmus's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the ceremonial cord meant to bind our joined hands, 25 years of grief and hope both catching up with him in the same quiet moment. "I, Ronan Ashgrave," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clear beneath it, "claim Wren Nixera as my Luna, my mate, my equal in every sense this crown demands. I vow to build with her, not merely rule beside her. I vow that no fear, no politics, no old rivalry will ever again come before choosing her, openly and completely, exactly as I choose her today." His eyes held mine through every word, steady and unwavering, and I understood, watching him, that this was a man who had waited his whole life without knowing it for exactly this moment, and had no intention of ever again letting fear dictate what he did with it. Elder Rasmus passed the cord into my hands, his eyes wet, and I gripped it tightly, grounding myself in its solid, simple weight before I spoke. "I, Wren Nixera," I said, my own voice carrying the full weight of everything the past 2 months had cost and given me both, "claim Ronan Ashgrave as my mate, my partner. The first person who ever looked at me and saw exactly who I was before I understood it myself. I vow that this crown will never again be used to hide, diminish, or trade away a woman's worth for someone else's convenience. I vow to build a region where no daughter, divine or otherwise, is ever again treated as a debt to be paid rather than a person to be chosen." The mark between us, given weeks before an urgency, settled deeper now, silver light passing between us in a slow, steady pulse that felt less like power and more like promise. A warmth that spread from my collarbone through my whole body until it felt indistinguishable from simple, ordinary happiness. Bianca stood just behind Cade as he spoke, and when he finished, she stepped forward herself, surprising the entire hall by asking to address the assembly directly. "I spent 7 years treating Wren's presence in that house as a threat to something I believed I was owed," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its unsteadiness. "I was wrong about most of it and cruel about the rest. I would like this council, and both packs, to know that whatever role Thornwood has for me going forward, I intend to spend it earning back a decency I spent 7 years forgetting I ever had." The hall received this with a quieter, more measured warmth than the earlier celebrations, respect rather than jubilation, the particular regard people reserve for someone visibly working to become better rather than simply asking to be forgiven. I caught her eye across the room and gave her a small nod, and something in her posture eased, as if she'd been bracing for rejection and received, instead, the first uncomplicated kindness I'd offered her since this entire ordeal began. Cade stepped forward when the formal vows concluded, and in front of the entire assembled council, offered one final gesture, not of romantic claim, long since resolved, but of genuine friendship finally, fully rebuilt. "Thornwood formally recognizes this union," he said, "and formally allies itself with Ashgrave, not as rival packs maintaining an uneasy peace, but as partners in whatever work remains to protect this region from what the Circle of Ash represented for 300 years. Wren, I am proud, finally, honestly, to call you my Luna's equal, my ally, and, I hope, in time, my friend." "You already are," I said, and meant it fully. 7 years of hurt finally, genuinely, settling into something closer to peace than I had ever expected to feel toward him. Chapter 40. Coronation of the Moon Queen. The crown itself, when Elder Rasmus finally placed it on my brow, was simple, a band of moon silver unadorned, carrying none of the ostentatious weight I might have expected from an Alpha King's Luna. It didn't need ornamentation. The silver light already living beneath my skin did all the work any crown could have done, and everyone in that hall could see it. Outside, past the tall windows, the moon had risen fully into view for the first time all evening, as if it too had been waiting for exactly this moment to finally show itself. "Rise," Elder Rasmus said, his old voice thick with an emotion 25 years in the making, tears finally spilling freely down a face that had carried this grief silently for longer than I'd been alive to witness it. Wren Calloway, Luna of Ashgrave, daughter of Selene, granddaughter of Nyx, the last hidden bloodline of the moon, fully claimed, fully chosen, fully home. The hall erupted in celebration that lasted long into the night, two packs who had spent generations circling each other with careful treaties and old suspicions, dancing and feasting together as genuine allies for the first time in either pack's memory. Somewhere in the crowd, Tomas was teaching an Ashgrave guard a Thornwood drinking song, badly, and neither of them seemed to mind. I moved through the celebration slowly, accepting congratulations from wolves who had spent 7 years walking past me without a second glance, and found I carried no bitterness about the reversal, only a quiet, settled gratitude that the reversal had happened at all. An older Thornwood elder I barely recognized pressed my hands warmly and told me she'd known my mother slightly, decades ago, and had always wondered what became of Selene's line. A young Ashgrave pup, no older than 6, tugged at my skirts and asked, with the blunt honesty only children manage, whether I could really talk to the moon. I knelt down to her height and told her that yes, sometimes, when the moon had something worth saying. She seemed satisfied with that answer and ran off to tell her friends, and I found myself laughing freely for what felt like the first time in longer than 7 years. Cade and Bianca stood together near the edge of the hall, something tentative but real building between them that I suspected, given time, might grow into its own quiet happiness. Elder Rasmus held court near the fire, telling stories of my mother to any wolf young enough not to have known her, keeping her memory alive exactly as he'd promised her he would, all those years ago. Ronan found me on the terrace overlooking the mountains, the same terrace where he'd first held my face in his hands after the hunter attack, and pulled me into an embrace that held none of the fear it had carried that night, only certainty, only peace, only the settled warmth of a future finally, fully chosen. Below us, the celebration's music drifted up faint and golden, and somewhere in that sound I could almost hear Elder Rasmus's laughter carrying above the rest, 25 years of grief finally allowed to rest. 7 years of doorways, I said quietly, watching the moon rise full and silver over Ashgrave's peaks. 7 years of being overlooked, underestimated, rejected in front of an entire pack that didn't think twice about it. I thought of the apron I'd worn that first night, the mud on my shoes, the rain that hadn't stopped for 3 days straight, and felt, standing here now, the strange grace of a story finally arriving exactly where it had always been headed. And now? Ronan asked, pulling me closer. Now I'm exactly where I was always meant to be, I said, feeling the goddess's warmth settle over the mountains like a blessing, feeling the crown on my brow and the mark on my skin and the power finally, fully mine, feeling, for the first time in my entire life, completely and unshakably home. Not because anyone assigned it to me, because I chose it myself and it chose me back. Above us, the moon shone full and bright over a region finally at peace, and somewhere in that silver light, I felt my mother's presence one final time, not grief anymore, but pride, unmistakable and warm. Watching her daughter become everything she had once sacrificed everything to protect. "Welcome home, little one," the goddess said softly, for the last time in exactly that voice, before settling into something quieter, more permanent. Not a voice in my head any longer, but simply the moon itself, steady and eternal. Watching over the daughter it had waited 300 years to finally, fully claim. Above Ashgrave's peaks and Thornwood's gray hills beyond them, and every mile of contested, healing ground between the two, the moon kept its steady, silver watch, exactly as it always had and always would. The end.